Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I remember that morning in 1993 like it was yesterday. I was on my usual patrol in White Lake, checking on the local reservation roads, feeling that familiar cool breeze on my face. It was early, maybe around 7 a.m., when I got the call from my partner about a possible break-in at a house that was supposed to be empty. The owners had been gone for a few weeks. Usually these calls turn out to be squatters or teens messing around, but something in my partner's voice told me this was different. I arrived at the address and met my partner out front. The door was clearly forced open, the frame splintered, and the lock completely busted. When I stepped inside, it felt like stepping into another world. The whole living room was a mess, chairs flipped over, broken glass all over the floor, and this strange, sticky substance smeared in symbols on the walls. It didn't look like paint or anything I recognized. It had a weird texture, almost like half-dried tar mixed with something organic. The sight of those symbols made my skin crawl because they weren't random scribbles. They had a pattern, almost ritualistic. Even though I was rattled, I tried to focus on my job. I remember scanning each corner, shining my flashlight around even though it was still daylight outside. Natural light barely came through the shattered windows because heavy curtains were drawn. There was this heavy, stale smell hanging in the air, and the silence felt oppressive, like the house was holding its breath. My partner pointed out deep claw-like marks on the wooden floor near the hallway. It was as if some large animal had scraped the floor, but the spacing of the gashes didn't match any creature I was familiar with. We moved carefully from room to room, our footsteps crunching on the broken glass. Every so often I'd hear something that sounded like distant pounding, almost rhythmic. At first I thought maybe it was my own pulse from how tense the situation was, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. It was like low-frequency drum beats echoing from somewhere below us. My partner and I exchanged a look, and I saw in his eyes the same confusion and unease I was feeling. That's when we realized the sound was coming from the basement. The stairs down there were narrow and creaky, and the walls leading down looked damp, with water stains and a slight drip in the corner. Each step felt like it might collapse under our weight, so we moved slowly, shining our flashlights ahead. The drum-like sound got louder the deeper we went. It was steady, but there was no clear source. By the time we reached the bottom, my heart was thudding in my chest in sync with whatever was making that pulsating noise. At the base of the stairs, we found ourselves in a large basement that smelled of mildew, but there was another smell too, earthy and rotten. The place was cluttered with old boxes, broken furniture, and piles of newspapers. Hidden behind one stack of crates was a closed door, almost blending in with the surroundings. My partner gestured toward it, and I felt my heart drop. Whatever was on the other side of that door, I had a feeling it wasn't good. The rhythmic pounding was now so loud, it felt like it was vibrating through my bones. Carefully, I turned the knob. The door opened with a creak that shot a chill down my spine. Inside, there wasn't much light, just a flickering bulb dangling from the ceiling, casting long shadows. The air felt heavier, and the sticky residue I'd seen upstairs streaked the walls in more symbols. It looked like some kind of bizarre shrine or maybe a meeting spot. Broken candles, some weird totems, and old animal bones scattered around. I remember a skull. Looked like it belonged to a large dog or wolf, but I wasn't sure. There were scratch marks on the concrete floor, arranged in a circle like a pattern. I felt sick to my stomach, like I was intruding on something that was never meant to be found. My partner and I were still trying to process all this when we heard noises coming from a side corridor. It led to a narrow passage that seemed to go behind the main basement walls. The corridor was barely lit, except for a small window at the very end that opened to the backyard. That must have been how someone got in or out. We knew we couldn't just turn back without checking it, so we moved in, stepping over debris, broken planks, scattered trash, and more of that god-awful sticky substance. The corridor opened to a cramped exit, leading into a narrow, overgrown alley behind the house. The moment we stepped outside, I felt the temperature drop. It was like being dunked in cold water. The drum sounds were still in my head, though I couldn't tell if they were still echoing from inside or if my imagination was running wild. I can't forget the sudden stillness that followed. The air felt electric, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. Then I heard a deep growl, so low and guttural it made my teeth vibrate. I froze, shining my flashlight toward the source of the sound. That's when I saw it. A massive figure hunched in the shadows at the far corner of the alley. It had fur, thick and dark, matted with dirt and possibly blood. Its eyes reflected red when the light hit them, like two burning coals in a wolf's face. But it was taller than any wolf, standing almost upright in a weird, hunched stance. Before I could fully register what I was seeing, the thing lunged. My partner got in its path, and I watched in horror as this creature slashed at him with claws that looked razor-sharp. He cried out and staggered back, blood staining his uniform. It all happened so fast, but in that brief moment, I swear I saw its features up close. Sharp fangs bared, an almost human-like structure to its torso, and limbs that seemed too long for its body. It was unnatural in every sense of the word. Instinct kicked in, and I reached for my gun, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep a grip. My partner was on the ground, trying to defend himself, but the creature's strength was unreal. I yelled, trying to distract it, and it turned its gaze on me. The terror that washed over me is something I still can't put into words. Every nerve in my body told me to run, but I fired a shot instead, not even sure if I hit it. The creature growled again, then bounded off into the darkness, disappearing as suddenly as it appeared. I rushed to my partner, who was bleeding from deep gashes on his shoulder and arm. He was conscious but clearly in shock. I helped him up, feeling the hair on my neck still standing on end, half expecting the creature to come back. But it never did. That eerie quiet returned, and we both staggered to our patrol car. I radioed for backup, trying to keep my voice steady, though I was shaking like a leaf. Paramedics and more officers arrived, and we told them about some kind of large animal. I saw doubt in their eyes. How do you explain something that looks like a wolf, but stands upright and tears through a solid wooden doorframe? They combed the area, but by the time they started searching, there was no trace of the creature, just footprints that looked canine but too large, and a trail of blood that vanished near some old sheds down the road. My partner was taken to the hospital. I stayed behind, helping the rest of the team secure the scene. People started whispering about werewolves and local legends, stuff I'd heard growing up but never believed in. Yet, the symbols, the strange shrine in the basement, and that monstrous figure all pointed to something beyond a regular animal attack. A few folks claimed they'd seen odd shapes lurking around the reservation before, but nothing concrete. I filed my report, and the official story mentioned a wild animal on the loose. But unofficially, everyone who was there that day knew it was something else. It felt like we'd stepped into a nightmare, and part of me still wonders if it followed me home. For weeks, I barely slept, replaying those red eyes and that huge silhouette lunging at my partner. It's something that's never left me. I wish I could say the investigation wrapped up neatly and we found a normal explanation. But as far as I know, nothing conclusive ever surfaced. There were rumors, more sightings late at night in the reservation, but no hard evidence. It's like it vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind nothing but questions and a sense of dread that still hangs over White Lake. Even all these years later, I get goosebumps remembering that guttural snarl. No official records ever called it a werewolf or a shapeshifter, but I know what I saw, and it was nothing ordinary. That day changed how I view my job, and honestly, how I look at the world. I'm sharing this now because I still can't fully explain it. Maybe someone out there has gone through something similar and knows what it was. All I know is that whatever was in that basement and whatever attacked my partner was beyond anything I was ever trained to face. It came out of nowhere, and then it was gone. And I've never been able to shake the feeling that one day it might come back. Story 2. I still remember the way the wind felt that day, like it was pushing against me no matter what direction I turned. It was early spring of 1995 in Bristol Creek, and I'd been on the road since dawn, hauling supplies out to a nearby reservation. I was exhausted, but also restless. My truck rattled along those worn-out roads, and every bump made me question if I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. About halfway through my route, I stopped at this old diner. It didn't look like much from the outside, but I was starving and figured I'd grab a quick meal. The place had wooden floors that creaked every time someone shifted their weight. Posters from the 50s and 60s hung on the walls, their edges curling with age. There were only a few patrons there, but I distinctly remember overhearing them talk about strange happenings around the reservation, like animals going missing and bizarre footprints. I tried to brush it off as just small-town gossip, but something about their hushed tones got under my skin. I downed my burger, noticing how the pickles tasted sourer than usual, and I left feeling uneasy. Back in my truck, that weird feeling followed me. The sky was that dull grey colour, the sun nearly swallowed by clouds, and the horizon looked so empty it made my stomach tighten. The road became more winding, and each twist revealed patches of forest that felt a little too still. I saw a couple of deer way off to the side, as if they'd bolted from something. That struck me as odd, but I just figured maybe there was a predator around, like a bear or a mountain lion. Bristol Creek was known for its wildlife, though I'd never seen any that caused deer to cower like that. After some miles, I started noticing a few animals lying by the roadside, injured and scattered. It was unsettling enough that I pulled over at one point to check if any were still alive, but every single one was either gone or too hurt. I remember the silence, too. No birds chirping, no wind rustling leaves, just my own breathing. My nerves were shot, but I told myself to keep going. Work doesn't wait, and I wanted to get the job done before dark. When I finally reached the reservation, 2 locals, Michael and Johnny, came over to help unload. They were just kids, late teens, early 20s maybe, but they were friendly enough. While we worked, I casually mentioned what I'd seen on the road, the frightened deer, the wounded animals. Their faces changed immediately. They swapped these serious looks, and for a moment I thought they might brush me off, but instead they told me they'd been finding strange footprints in the nearby woods. Footprints that didn't look entirely human or animal. They didn't elaborate much, but I could see the tension in their eyes. It was the same kind of tension I'd felt creeping along my spine all day. I was about to ask more when we heard this piercing scream from the tree line. It wasn't too far off, so we all dropped what we were doing and rushed to see what had happened. We found a woman from the reservation pinned under a fallen branch, crying out for help. I knelt beside her and saw she had a bad gash on her leg, but she was still conscious and pleading for us to get her free. Michael and Johnny told me they'd call for an ambulance and some extra help, so I ran back to my truck to grab my phone. It was one of those older models, huge and heavy, but it worked in most places. That's when I saw it. By the side of the truck, in the corner of my eye, something moved. My brain registered it faster than my eyes did. It was tall, almost unnaturally tall. and when it shifted I could see elongated limbs and a face that didn't look right. The teeth were too sharp, and it had a posture that looked more beast than man. It let out this low, guttural sound, like a growl or a hiss. It made every hair on my body stand on end. I stumbled backwards, dropping my phone in the dirt. My mind screamed at me to run, so I did. I sprinted back to Michael and Johnny, babbling about what I saw. I'm pretty sure my words got jumbled in my panic, but they got the message. We all started looking around, and for a second I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But then, between the trees, I saw the silhouette again. It was watching us like we were prey. Michael gestured toward an old, run-down cabin a little ways off. We half-dragged, half-carried the injured woman there. Inside, the place smelled like dust and damp wood. We barricaded the door with a heavy table and tried to collect ourselves. My chest felt tight, and my pulse pounded in my ears. The only light came from a lantern Johnny found, and each flicker of that lantern made the shadows in the corners shift. We stayed quiet, all of us too scared to speak above a whisper. Michael broke the silence by mentioning local tales about skinwalkers. I'd heard the term before, but only in passing. He said something about them being shapeshifters, able to walk between forms, part human, part animal. Normally I would have rolled my eyes, but I couldn't deny what I'd seen. Something was out there, something that defied any explanation I had. The injured woman was pale and trembling. I did my best to keep her calm, pressing a makeshift bandage on her leg. Johnny tried calling for help on his phone, but the service was spotty. Every minute felt like an hour. Outside, we could hear rustling, branches snapping. At one point, I heard a sharp scraping against the cabin wall. It was like nails or claws dragging across the wood. I don't know how long we stayed holed up in that cabin. I kept expecting whatever was outside to break down the door. My imagination ran wild, picturing it slinking through a window or smashing through the flimsy walls. But it never did. Instead, it circled us, letting out occasional growls that made my insides twist. Michael clutched a small hunting knife, though I doubted it'd do much good against something like that. Eventually, we heard distant voices. The rescue team. Flashlights flickered through the trees, and we started shouting for them. When they reached us, everything got chaotic fast. The medics rushed to the injured woman, and a couple of the guys looked around, trying to see if there was any sign of a predator. Nothing. It was like the forest had swallowed whatever that thing was. The air felt heavier than ever, but in a different way, like something had just left, and the space it occupied was still charged. They got the woman onto a stretcher and whisked her away. Michael and Johnny stuck close to the medics, and I was left alone for a moment, staring out at the dark tree line. I could have sworn I saw a pair of eyes watching me from a distance. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, like any sudden movement would bring it right back to us. The next thing I knew, one of the rescue workers called my name, snapping me out of whatever trance I was in. I followed them back to the main area of the reservation. People were gathered around, whispering about the possible attacker, about the animals, about the footprints they'd found. I kept replaying everything in my head, the screams, the cabin, those eyes. I tried to find some logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Nobody else had a solid explanation either. After the dust settled, I got back in my truck. Somehow, I still had to finish the delivery paperwork and continue my job. The normalcy of that task felt almost absurd. I drove out of the reservation at sunset, half expecting to see that creature leap into the road, but I never saw it again. The road was eerily calm, just that same grey sky giving way to night. To this day, I can't explain what happened. It was real, I know that much. I felt its presence. I heard its growls. I saw its distorted shape in the trees, and then, nothing. It just vanished, like it was never there. But the memory didn't vanish. It stuck with me, and it still gives me the chills whenever I think about it. Sometimes, when I'm driving through remote areas late at night, I'll catch myself scanning the tree line, half hoping to never see anything like it again, but also bracing for the possibility that I might. That's the part that really gets me. It showed up out of nowhere, then disappeared without a trace, leaving me to wonder if it was all in my head or if there really is something lurking in places we don't dare to look too closely. I still don't know. But I do know I'll never forget that day in Bristol Creek. And every once in a while, I'll see a flash of movement in my rearview mirror and feel that same surge of dread. I guess I'll always carry that feeling with me, like a reminder that not everything can be understood or outrun. Story 3. I still remember the exact date, August 14th, 1990. It was scorching hot in Rosewood Hill, and I was part of a construction crew building new houses near a tribal reservation between Arizona and New Mexico. I was 27 back then, young, but already used to tough outdoor work. That morning started normal enough. We were mixing cement, setting up wooden frames, just another day. But by the time the sun set, I was shaking so bad I could barely hold a flashlight. We had lunch around noon in a shaded area near the trucks because the sun was hitting hard. After I finished my sandwich, I headed back alone to the worksite. That's when I saw one of the guys, Rudy, lying near the betonera, our cement mixer. At first, I thought he was taking a break, but then I noticed he was completely still, face in the dirt. My stomach dropped. I sprinted over and shook him. He came to slowly, blinking like he'd just woken up from a nightmare. I noticed weird scratches on his boots, thin, parallel lines, almost like something clawed at him. He had no idea how he got them and kept saying he felt dizzy and saw something move behind him right before he blacked out. That was enough to set everyone on edge. We tried to joke it off at first, maybe a stray dog or coyote got too close. But deep down, I already knew something felt off. About an hour later, another guy, Don, said he saw a big shape shifting in the trees beyond the cleared area. He caught just a glimpse, like a ripple in the air. He described it as if the heat was creating a mirage, but it had a definite outline, tall and wide. Of course, a few of us teased him for imagining things in the heat, but you could see the fear in his eyes. It spread through our little group faster than I expected. Nobody wanted to admit they were spooked, but the silence said it all. Not long after that, chaos erupted. Gary, my friend on the crew, came running, yelling about someone missing. At first, I only caught every other word because he was out of breath and sweating bullets. He kept saying, "He's just gone, man. He's gone." The missing guy, Martin, had been working with Gary on a side of the lot closer to the tree line. They'd taken a quick break to cool off. Gary stepped away to fetch water, and when he came back, Martin was gone. All that remained were his tools scattered around a small clearing. A hammer, a measuring tape, some nails spilled onto the dirt. Martin's hard hat was turned upside down, and the chin strap was torn. It gave me goosebumps. It looked like it had been ripped right off his head. We fanned out to search, hearts pounding. I remember seeing footprints that looked almost human, but bigger, deeper, and definitely off in some way, like whoever or whatever made them had claws or an odd shape to the sole. We combed through the underbrush, calling Martin's name, but there was no response, just the echo of our voices bouncing back. Then something else happened, like fate was taunting us. One of the newer workers, Hector, screamed. We all rushed over, expecting the worst. His arm was covered in nasty cuts, the kind of slashes you'd see from an animal attack, but none of us saw any creature near him. He was shaking, insisting something grabbed him from behind. He said it was large, smelled foul, and had rough hands or claws. Of course, nobody knew what to believe. We were in broad daylight with about a dozen people around, yet no one else saw a thing. That's when rumors about a wailing walker started creeping into our conversations. A few locals we'd hired had told us about old legends, but nobody took them seriously until that day. The name alone made my hair stand on end. They said it roamed these parts for centuries, feeding on fear or something like that. I tried to shove those thoughts out of my head, but it was impossible once your brain latched onto it. We decided we couldn't handle it alone, so we got on the radio to contact local authorities. They showed up, walked around, asked some questions, and left looking almost as puzzled as us. They said we might be dealing with a large predator, maybe a bear that wandered in. But in this region, that made little sense. They couldn't give us any real reassurance, just told us to stay alert. As if that wasn't bad enough, heavy equipment started acting up by mid-afternoon. The generator would cut out, the power tools would randomly stop. We found footprints in the dirt near the generator that weren't there an hour earlier. They were huge, spaced in a way that suggested a tall being with a stride longer than any of us could replicate. People were on edge and wanted to pack up, but the foreman insisted we at least secure the site before we all went home. A few guys volunteered to stay behind till evening, just to see if Martin would turn up, or if the authorities might come back with more help. I wish I could say I volunteered out of bravery, but honestly, it was more out of concern for Martin and a stubborn need to see what was messing with us. Twilight came fast. The desert sky turned a deep orange, then purple, making every shadow stretch out like long fingers. We heard distant howls, but nothing like a coyote or wolf. It was lower in pitch, almost a moaning wail that made my teeth ache. Gary stood next to me, gripping a flashlight so hard his knuckles turned white. Neither of us said a word, but I could practically taste his fear. Then we saw it, or at least we saw its silhouette. Something moved among the half-built frames of the new houses, weaving through the beams with unnatural speed. Every hair on my body stood up. It was tall, definitely bigger than any person on site, and it seemed to flicker in and out of the darkness, like it didn't fully belong in our world. Gary raised his flashlight, but by the time the beam landed, it was gone. My heart hammered so violently I thought I'd pass out. We heard shots ring out from the other side of the site. Some of the guys had rifles for safety. They claimed they saw something dart from behind a stack of lumber. It took 4 or 5 rounds before the creature vanished into the tree line, leaving the entire worksite dead silent. We found no blood, no trail, just enormous footprints leading back into the thick brush. The strangest part was how everything just stopped after that. We stood there trembling, guns in hand, eyes scanning every corner. But there was nothing. No wail, no footsteps, no sign of that translucent shape. It was as if the desert itself had gone quiet. We spent another hour combing the site, hoping Martin would return, or we'd at least see some clue. The only things we found were broken tools and a few more boot prints from whoever was running around earlier, possibly Martin in a panic, or maybe something else entirely. When we finally decided to pack up, none of us had answers. Martin was officially listed as missing. We never saw him again. To this day, the local authorities list his case as unresolved. The next morning, the crew showed up as usual, acting like we just had to finish the job and move on. Nobody wanted to openly talk about what happened the previous day. It was like we had some unspoken pact to keep quiet. And so we finished construction in the days that followed. We had no real choice. But that single day still replays in my head whenever I'm alone and hear strange noises at night. Sometimes I wonder if we accidentally built on sacred land we had no business disturbing, and whatever we awoke just decided to give us a warning. Or maybe it was a flesh-and-blood creature that's never been documented, lurking in those canyons and forests. I don't know, and honestly I'm not sure I want to. All I can say is that it was real enough to leave scars on my memory. Scars just as real as the ones on Hector's arm and on Rudy's boots. I still get chills when I think about the size of those footprints and that eerie, distorted shape in the twilight. The day ended with us huddled around the trucks, waiting for the authorities to show up again, hoping we'd have something concrete to tell them. But by then, everything had gone quiet. No more screams, no more howls, nothing. It was like a nightmare that disappeared at dawn. And maybe that's all it was. But it felt more real than anything I've ever experienced. Even now, decades later, I haven't made peace with it. I don't think I ever will. All I know is that something dangerous and very real was out there, and it left its mark on me and every other person who stayed that evening. If you ever hear those old tales about the Wailing Walker or see odd shapes out in the desert, don't dismiss them. I learned the hard way that sometimes old stories aren't just stories, they're warnings, and what happened in Rosewood Hill is still the most terrifying day of my life. Story 4. I still remember the exact feeling in my gut that evening in 1992 during the annual powwow at Ashford Plains near the Yakima Reservation. I had been helping in one of the stands all day, arranging handmade crafts and greeting visitors. The atmosphere was warm and inviting. Drums, laughter, the smell of fry bread, and the steady hum of people sharing stories. Nothing felt out of place until dusk settled in, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. That was when everything shifted. Someone let out a shriek from the tree line, and it hit my ears like a sudden alarm. I looked up, and I could see a small group running from the woods, clearly distressed. Word spread that a young woman had been attacked by something. The people who found her couldn't agree on what it was, only that it didn't look normal. She was injured but awake, gasping through her shock. I felt a surge of responsibility. I'd seen enough medical emergencies to know we had to get her to the clinic, so I joined a small group who volunteered to take her there immediately. I grabbed my canivete, a small pocket knife I'd carried since I was a kid. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. We carried the girl on a makeshift stretcher, heading toward the clinic down a narrow trail through the woods. The organizers at the powwow lit torches to guide us, but the fog that rolled in made them seem weak and flickering. The air felt moist against my face, and each step kicked up the earthy smell of pine needles and wet soil. Normally, I find those smells comforting, but that night, it all felt suffocating. We kept stopping because we heard noises, crunching leaves, strange snapping sounds like twigs under pressure, always close but never in clear view. Even the forest animals seemed to vanish. I remember hearing someone mention that local elders told stories of creatures known as Wendigo. I tried to brush it off as folklore, but the way the trees seemed to close in around us made me wonder if there was some truth to it. One of my friends in the group ran a flashlight across a row of tree trunks, and we saw large scratch marks on the bark. They looked fresh. They were deep, almost like a bear's claws, but spaced differently. I could see the worry in everyone's eyes, but we tried to remain calm for the injured girl. Her breathing was shallow, and we kept talking to her in hushed voices just to reassure her. I started feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up every time the wind gusted, and I don't think it was from the cold. The thick fog seemed to swirl around us, occasionally revealing footprints, huge footprints that made no sense. They looked like they belonged to some large animal, but the shape was all wrong. Each time we spotted them, our pace quickened. I tried to keep my eyes scanning the trees on both sides, trying to catch any movement. The thought that something was stalking us hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. Out of nowhere, a low, guttural growl reverberated through the woods. It was so deep I felt it in my chest. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. The flashlight beam darted around frantically, but we couldn't see anything beyond the fog and the flickering torchlight. Then, something dark and fast shifted between the trees. It moved in a way that reminded me of a large cat. smooth, powerful, deliberate. My heart jumped. We formed a protective circle around the injured girl, and someone near me whispered to stay calm, but I couldn't calm down. I was gripping my pocket knife so hard my knuckles were white. A branch snapped loudly just a few yards away, and that shape lunged at us. In the confusion, a few people swung whatever they had: sticks, a rock, even a rolled-up blanket. I remember feeling a brush of air as it rushed past, its silhouette larger than any animal I'd seen up close in those woods. It let out a raspy snarl, and the torchlight caught a glimpse of something matted and dark, but I couldn't see its face clearly. It seemed almost furious that we were resisting. Then, just as quickly as it charged, it pulled back into the shadows. We took that moment to run. The injured girl cried out in pain as we jostled the stretcher, but we didn't have a choice. No one wanted to stay put. I remember my legs shaking, muscles burning, and the sense that we were being herded. We scrambled through the undergrowth, stumbling but never stopping, until we finally saw the clinic's back porch light. It felt like an impossible beacon of safety in the middle of pure darkness. My lungs were on fire when we reached the door. Once we got inside, staff rushed to help the injured girl. She was in shock, shaking uncontrollably but still conscious. My brain was racing, wondering if that creature had followed us. Another person in our group started calling the powwow organizers, telling them to warn everyone to stay close to the main area and not wander off. My own voice was shaky when I tried to explain what happened. I felt a bizarre mix of relief and terror, like I'd just escaped a nightmare that didn't really end. Local authorities and some of the powwow officials showed up at the clinic shortly after. I watched as they took statements, made notes about the footprints and the scratches on the trees. Nobody seemed to agree on what it could have been. Some wanted to say it was a bear with a weird paw deformity. Others thought it was a prank gone horribly wrong. But the girl's injuries were real. Her torn clothes and deep scratches were impossible to dismiss. Her eyes had that haunting look of someone who had just stared into something beyond comprehension. I spent most of that night pacing the clinic halls, too wired to sit still. Even though the creature didn't show itself again, I couldn't shake the feeling it was still out there, watching. Eventually, a couple of older community members arrived. They spoke quietly among themselves about old legends and the possibility that a Wendigo or similar spirit roamed these woods. I caught bits and pieces of their conversation, enough to understand that they believed something ancient might have been awakened or disturbed. I didn't know what to think. I just kept recalling that menacing silhouette and how it moved with that unnatural swiftness. In the end, the local authorities didn't find conclusive evidence. They made plaster casts of the footprints, but they came out inconclusive. They took photos of the claw marks, but there was no official statement on them. Everything got labeled inconclusive or possibly a large animal. After a few hours, people who had been at the powwow started heading back to their homes, and the energy in the entire region felt tense, like the community had collectively held its breath. No one wanted to linger outdoors any longer than necessary. By the time dawn arrived, it was eerily quiet. The clinic staff told me the girl would recover, but she'd need follow-up care for her wounds. That was a relief at least. But none of us got an answer about what actually happened. The creature never reappeared that night, and as far as I know, no one else was attacked in the following weeks. Yet the memory of that day stuck with me. How normal it had started and how it descended into chaos so fast. I still can't explain exactly what I saw in those woods. Thinking back on it, I feel this mix of dread and curiosity. Part of me wants to know more, to understand if it was really some kind of spirit or just a freak incident with a wild animal. But the larger part of me doesn't want to face that fear again. Sometimes I think maybe it's better that I don't have a clear explanation. It happened, it ended, and there's a part of me that believes it might be best left as one of those mysteries that never fully unravel. Even all these years later, I keep my eyes open whenever I'm near the woods at dusk. I can't help but feel there's something out there, something we don't fully understand, waiting in the dark. Story 5. I still remember that late afternoon in 1997, like it just happened yesterday. I'd finished my shift at the Falling Brook Wildlife Center, an unusually quiet day with no emergency calls or distressed animals needing rescue. It was nice to have a bit of peace for once. Since it was my turn to clock out, I felt a sense of relief and decided to meet my friends, Albert and Donna, at a small diner we loved to visit whenever we got the chance. The diner was mostly empty, apart from a couple of regulars chatting in the corner. The three of us were in a great mood, joking about how the hardest part of our day had been deciding what to order for lunch. We were on our second round of coffee when we heard it, a scream so sharp and desperate that everyone inside went quiet in seconds. My stomach dropped. The sound had come from right outside. We rushed to the front door, hesitating just a second before pushing it open. Standing there in the dimming light was a man clutching his arm. He looked absolutely terrified, and there was blood soaking through his sleeve. He kept stammering that something attacked him, that it came out of nowhere. At first, I thought maybe it was a stray dog or a wolf, but something about his eyes told me he believed it was worse than that. I remember feeling torn between trying to calm him down and wanting to see the wound. When he peeled his hand away from the slash on his arm, I realized it was deeper than any normal animal bite I'd seen in the wildlife center. Albert tried to call for an ambulance, but the phone lines were acting up. No dial tone, just static. That's not unusual in Falling Brook, but it was the worst timing imaginable. Donna immediately volunteered to run to the local police station a few blocks away to get help in person. I kept trying to comfort the man, telling him to breathe, that we would get him medical attention soon. But he could barely speak, just kept saying he saw something huge and wrong. Before Donna even made it down the street, we heard this low, guttural noise echo from one of the alleys near the diner. It was such a strange sound, almost like a mix between a deep growl and a person moaning. I could feel my heart pounding. The man's eyes went wide, and he stumbled closer to me, begging not to leave him alone. Albert and I quickly ushered him into the diner. One of the employees locked the front door, and another ran to bolt the side entrance. Nobody wanted to risk whatever was out there following us inside. That's when the real tension began to build. The guy was trembling. I was trying to find a first aid kit, and Albert kept pacing by the windows, occasionally peering through the blinds. It felt like the air got heavier, almost suffocating. Everyone in the diner grew quiet again, like we were all holding our breath, waiting for something else to happen. Suddenly, we heard loud thumps around the back of the building. It sounded like something large was skulking around, bumping into trash cans and scraping against the walls. There was a weird squeaking noise, almost like metal being dragged. The adrenaline hit me so hard I could taste it at the back of my throat. I had no idea what we were dealing with, but I knew it wasn't normal. Albert decided to check the fuse box when the light started flickering. I never realized how dark that hallway leading to the back of the diner could be, especially with the power acting up. Even so, he insisted on going alone. I think he wanted everyone else to stay in one spot, to stay safe. I remember staring at him as he walked away with a flashlight, feeling torn between letting him do it and not wanting to split up. But he was determined. Minutes felt like hours. While Albert was gone, the rest of us heard this scraping along the outside walls. It got closer and louder, almost circling the building. The injured man began to hyperventilate, and I tried to keep him calm, pressing a wad of napkins against his wound. Then we heard a sudden thud against the metal door at the back of the diner, like someone or something throwing itself against it. A moment later, Albert rushed back, breathing heavily, saying he found the fuse box, but nothing seemed wrong there. He looked rattled, though. I didn't push him for details. Before we could figure out our next move, Donna burst back in through the front door, nearly colliding with one of the employees who had just unlocked it for her. She was short of breath, saying the police were tied up with another situation on the outskirts of town. She'd told them something dangerous was lurking here, but they said it might take a while for officers to show up. In that moment, the fear in the diner was almost tangible. You could sense everyone thinking, "We're on our own." Then, as if things weren't eerie enough, this thick fog rolled in outside, swallowing the nearby streetlights. I've seen fog in Falling Brook before, but I'd never seen it sweep in that fast. It was like a wall of grey just enveloped the building, making it impossible to see more than a foot beyond the windows. The tension rose to a new high. We all stayed away from the glass, partly because we couldn't see anything out there, and partly because we didn't want to be any closer to whatever might be lurking in the dark. We waited for what felt like an eternity, hearts pounding, flinching at every sound. The lights would flicker on and off, creating these brief moments of total darkness. My pulse was hammering in my ears so loud I could barely think straight. Then, finally, we heard the sound of vehicles rolling up. A group from the Wildlife Reserve, some agents I recognized, pulled up in a truck, along with a couple of local volunteers. They called out from outside, and we scrambled to unlock the doors for them. When they got in, we felt this brief surge of hope, like maybe everything was going to be okay. But after a quick discussion, they decided to do a perimeter check around the diner. A few of us tagged along, though most people stayed inside. Even with flashlights, it was nearly impossible to see more than a few steps ahead in the fog. What little we did see were these bizarre, deep footprints in the muddy patches near the dumpsters. They were spaced far apart, like something with a massive stride had been there. Some marks looked like claws had scraped across the ground. I remember one of the reserve agents, a guy named Patrick, shaking his head as he compared the prints to his own boots. He looked genuinely unnerved. We didn't find any creature, just those eerie footprints and scratches along the walls. By the time the fog started to lift, it was late, and the police finally arrived to take statements. No one could figure out exactly what happened or what had attacked that man. Some older folks in town mentioned old legends, calling it a Wendigo or some type of forest spirit. Others just shrugged and said it must have been a rabid animal. The only thing we all agreed on was that whatever it was, it had vanished as quickly as it appeared. Even now, I can't fully explain that night. I've worked with wildlife for years, but I've never seen anything like those tracks or heard sounds like that before. Sometimes I'll lie awake thinking about how big that thing must have been, or remembering the absolute terror on that man's face when he described it attacking him. It made me realize there might be things out there we can't catalog or study, things that slip right under our radar until they decide to show themselves. After that night, folks in Falling Brook stayed on high alert for weeks, and my friends and I helped out with makeshift patrols alongside the authorities. But nothing like that ever happened again, at least not that I heard of. People moved on, the world kept spinning, and eventually it just became another scary story folks whispered about. But if you ask me, that night wasn't just a legend. I still get chills every time I think about those footprints in the mud and the haunting growl echoing in the fog. I don't know what it was, but I'll never forget the sense of dread it left behind. Story 6. I still remember the exact chill in the air that morning in 1994. It was right after a heavy storm, and the forest trail was a mess of broken branches and wet leaves. I'd been a forest ranger at Brookfield Ridge for a couple of years, and usually my biggest worries involved patching up hiking signs or checking for fallen trees. That day felt different from the moment I stepped outside. As I walked along a narrow trail, I noticed something almost hidden under a cluster of ferns, fresh bones. They weren't bleached or scattered like I'd expect from natural decay. They were arranged in this weird, deliberate way, and there were dark red stains around them. My first reaction was shock, then a wave of dread. It didn't look like the work of usual predators. Coyotes and pumas typically leave messy bite marks, and you can see tooth patterns. But these bones had long, thin slashes, like something used razor-sharp claws. I bundled the remains in a tarp, hands trembling as I shoved them into my truck and drove to the small base we had in the reserve. My cousin, R, was there, and she was our go-to person for any kind of forensic analysis. She's the kind of person who can identify an animal just by the shape of a tooth. But when she examined these remains, her expression changed in a way I'd never seen before. She kept tracing the slash marks with her fingertips, shaking her head. She said they looked too precise, almost deliberate, and definitely not from any local wildlife we knew. While we were still trying to process the situation, we heard a truck pull up outside. It was Thomas Strongland, a local who often hikes around the ridge. He looked pale, like he'd seen a ghost. He started explaining that, just before dawn, he caught sight of a creature in the woods, something that moved too fast for him to describe properly. His exact words were along the lines of, "It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a cat, but it moved on 4 legs, kinda." He kept saying kinda, like he couldn't figure out if it ran on 2 or 4 limbs. He was so rattled that he insisted we take his story seriously. Given what R and I had just seen, there was no way we could ignore him. Everything started escalating from that point. The atmosphere felt oppressive, like a thunderstorm was still hovering above us. We decided that we couldn't just file a report and call it a day. If there was some unknown animal around, or worse, some unexplainable thing prowling the woods, it was our job to protect the folks living around Brookfield Ridge. So we contacted a few friends, people we trusted who were used to nighttime patrols. We gathered rifles loaded with tranquilizers, flashlights stronger than car headlights, and set up a plan to patrol the key areas of the reserve. We split into small teams around dusk. I remember my own heart hammering in my chest the entire time, like I was about to walk into a nightmare. The woods were eerily silent, except for the occasional gust of wind rustling the leaves. Normally you'd hear insects or distant owl calls, but that night it was dead quiet. Every footstep sounded too loud. Every snap of a twig felt like it could be the start of something horrible. A while into our patrol, one of our guys radioed in, sounding nearly out of breath. He said he heard heavy rustling in the bushes, followed by a deep, guttural snarl. We immediately gathered and headed toward his position. When we got there, we found torn branches and clear footprints in the muddy ground. They were huge, with an odd shape that didn't match any known predator I'd ever tracked. It looked like it had 4 toes, long, narrow, and these claw marks dug so deep into the earth they might have been 1/2 inch deep. Whatever it was, it left the area in a hurry, and we had no idea which direction it took next. We continued sweeping the area, flashlights flickering across every shadow. At some point, I felt this overwhelming sense of being watched. It wasn't just nerves, it felt like eyes were pinned on me from somewhere behind the trees. I'd turn quickly, shining my light through the branches, but I never actually saw anything, just glimpses of movement. Or maybe it was my own imagination. My cousin R was close by, trying to keep a level head, but I saw her clutching the rifle so tightly her knuckles went white. Not long after, we caught a strong, nauseating smell. It was like a mix of wet fur and rotting meat, unmistakably animalistic, but somehow different from anything I'd smelled before. We spread out in a loose formation, inching forward. My flashlight fell on one of the big pine trees up ahead, and I noticed deep scratch marks across the trunk. They were spaced wider than any lion or bear claw I'd seen, each gouge nearly a foot long. It was like someone had raked a set of massive blades across the bark. All of a sudden, we heard a piercing, almost shrill cry echo through the forest. It made every hair on my body stand on end. In that split second, the silence that followed was deafening. We stood there, breath caught in our throats, scanning the darkness. That was when something huge bolted past the tree line, just at the edge of my flashlight's reach. I only caught a glimpse, a silhouette lower to the ground than a person, but taller than any mountain lion. The movement was jerky and unnatural, and the speed was insane. It vanished as fast as it appeared. We rushed to follow, stumbling over roots and rocks. By the time we got near the spot, it was gone. All we found were more footprints and a broken sapling where something large must have barreled through. The stench in the air was even stronger. I remember crouching down to touch the broken branches, my hand shaking. Whatever was out there, it wasn't acting like any normal animal. It felt like it was toying with us. We regrouped near one of the old fire watchtowers, hearts pounding, adrenaline through the roof. Some folks wanted to keep pushing deeper into the woods, but I made the call to pull back. We had too little information, and the last thing we wanted was to lose someone in the dark. We decided to head back to the base and analyze what we had. The footprints, the scratch marks, and that bizarre odor that seemed to linger on our clothes. When we got back, a few of the others started comparing notes with R. They'd found footprints near some of the lodges too, and branches snapped in impossibly high places, like whatever it was could leap or climb better than any normal creature. We speculated about a mutated cougar or some new species, but no theory fit everything we'd witnessed. It just didn't add up. By the early hours of the morning, we were all exhausted, both physically and mentally. We stored the rifles and flashlights, locked up the base, and tried to figure out our next move. That's when it hit me how scared I really was. I'd never encountered anything that made me question my entire sense of reality out there. Wildlife can be fierce, but this was something else, and I could see the same fear in everyone's eyes. Strangely, after that night, we didn't see or hear anything else. We spent the next few hours monitoring the perimeter, but the forest stayed unnervingly calm. No more broken branches, no more footprints, no more eerie noises. It was like the creature had just melted back into the darkness. By sunrise, we were left standing there, each of us with more questions than answers. I wish I could tie this up with a neat conclusion, but I can't. Even now, I have no idea what we encountered in Brookfield Ridge that night. Locals sometimes hint they've heard weird sounds in the distance, and I still get uneasy if I'm alone on the trails. All I know is that those bones, those scratch marks, that impossible stench, none of it makes sense in the world I thought I knew so well. It all began and ended so abruptly, it's almost like it wanted us to know it existed, then vanished the moment we got too close. I never found solid proof or a reasonable explanation. It's been years, and I still can't step into the forest during a storm without feeling that twist of dread in my stomach. As far as I'm concerned, there's more out there than we're prepared to understand. And sometimes it's best to remember that we don't own these woods. They can keep their secrets. And that thing, whatever it was, can stay hidden, far away from me. Story 7. I remember that day in 1998 like it happened yesterday. It was a brutal afternoon in Silverwood town, Arizona, and the heat felt like it was pressing down on me every time I took a breath. My job as a forest ranger had taught me to handle some pretty extreme conditions, but the desert sun that day was on another level. I was on patrol with my colleagues, a lawyer Red Crow and M. Stonehorse, when we got a call about personal belongings scattered on a restricted trail. Right away, that set off all kinds of alarms in my head. Usually, people who wander onto those trails do it by mistake, but the items left behind sounded too intentional, like someone wanted us to find them. We set out, hoping we were just dealing with some careless campers. But as soon as we stepped off the main path, there was this strange heaviness in the air. It didn't feel like the usual hush of nature. Instead, there was a weird tension, like the forest itself was on edge. The breeze that occasionally passed through felt stale, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be there. The trail was forbidden for good reason. Rough terrain, sudden drops, and local legends about dangerous wildlife. But I'd been patrolling these areas for a while, and I'd never felt anything like this before. As we moved deeper, we found pieces of clothing, a jacket hanging off a low branch, a ripped sleeping bag half buried in the dirt, a few scattered cans of food. Nothing was laid out neatly. It looked like someone had just bolted in pure panic. We followed the trail of belongings until we reached a small clearing. There was an improvised campsite in absolute chaos. Tent poles snapped, backpacks overturned, even half-cooked food lying around. I felt a chill crawl up my spine despite the scorching heat. The surrounding brush had broken branches and trampled grass, like some kind of struggle had gone down. But that wasn't the worst part. The entire spot felt wrong. I know that sounds vague, but I swear it was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We searched for footprints or blood or any clue about where the campers might have gone, but it was all inconclusive. Just a mess, like they'd sprinted off without a single thought. As we continued along the trail, we came across this small wooden shelter. Nothing fancy, just an old structure someone had probably thrown together years ago for quick cover against storms. The walls were scratched up in a way that didn't match any local wildlife I knew. The claw marks, if that's what they were, seemed too irregular, almost deliberate. M. Stonehorse ran his fingers along the marks, and he looked genuinely rattled. We were guessing maybe a cougar or a black bear, but something in my gut told me that wasn't right. That's when we heard the first sound, a low, raspy noise that stopped me cold. It wasn't a growl, but it also wasn't any normal animal call I'd heard out there. It seemed to echo off the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint exactly where it came from. All three of us went quiet, straining to listen. We heard branches snapping just a few dozen yards away. My adrenaline kicked in so hard I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. A lawyer whispered that he saw something move between the trees. I glanced over just in time to catch a shaped dart behind a trunk, much too fast for me to make out details. But for a split second, I saw what looked like a tall figure with elongated limbs. It had a strange gait, part crouch, part stride, like it was comfortable on all fours, but could walk upright if it wanted to. My mind scrambled to label it. Maybe a large animal with some sort of deformity. But I couldn't quite convince myself. It looked almost human, yet definitely not human. We huddled together, trying to decide whether to investigate or retreat, and that's when we heard the second sound, a sharp, high-pitched screech that turned my stomach. It echoed around the forest, and then everything went dead silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. I was scared, but we had a duty to figure out what was going on. There could have been missing hikers in serious trouble. We pressed on carefully, shining our flashlights into every dark pocket, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here? Are you hurt?" Over and over, only to have our voices swallowed up by the silence. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something dart from one tree to another, faster than I thought any person could run. It was definitely upright, towering at least a foot taller than me. Before I could fully register it, the figure vanished again. My skin went cold, and I started doubting everything I believed about the wildlife in this area. We tried to close ranks and move as one unit, but I could feel the dread crawling all over me. The air felt heavy, like breathing was harder than usual. Then I heard that wheezing, rasping breath again, this time coming from behind us. I spun around so quickly I nearly lost my footing. The undergrowth rustled, and I swear I saw eyes reflecting our flashlight beam for a fraction of a second, the way predator eyes shine at night, but these were at chest height, not near the ground. I yelled for us to move back toward the main path. We weren't prepared for a confrontation with something we didn't understand. My chest was tight, heart pounding like I'd just sprinted a mile. M. Stonehorse and a lawyer looked as shaken as I felt. It takes a lot to rattle seasoned rangers, but we all sensed something was horribly off. The weirdest part was how abruptly it ended. 1 minute we were scanning the trees, certain that thing was circling us. The next minute, the forest seemed normal again. We heard regular forest sounds, a faint breeze, even a few birds off in the distance. It was like whatever was out there decided to back off or just vanished into thin air. We carefully made our way out, sticking close, and when we finally stepped back into more familiar territory, none of us said a word. We didn't need to. We all knew we'd seen something that defied any normal explanation. Back in town, we reported what happened and shared every detail we could recall. Authorities brought in wildlife specialists, but there was no hard evidence, no clear footprints, no fur samples, no photos. They chalked it up to stress, or maybe a misidentified animal. But I was there, and I know we didn't imagine it. Whatever we encountered left me with a dread I still haven't shaken. People started whispering about regional legends, wendigos, skinwalkers, things you only hear about in old stories. I don't like to label it, because I genuinely don't know what it was. All I know is that after that day, I never looked at those woods the same. Sometimes on quiet nights, I catch myself thinking I hear that raspy breath again, echoing in the back of my mind. It's been years, and there's still a part of me that wonders if we just stumbled into something we weren't supposed to see, like a secret the forest guards with everything it has. Even now, I can't fully explain what happened. All I can say is that something was out there, powerful and terrifying, and for whatever reason, it let us go. I haven't gone back down that trail since, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. No matter how many people try to rationalize it or dismiss it, I know what I felt that day. Sometimes that alone is enough to keep me awake at night, replaying those moments in my head, wishing I had a clear explanation, but never quite finding one. Story 8. I still remember how the air felt that night, thick with tension, like the entire forest knew something was off. It was 1991 in Harvest Grove, and I had been driving the ambulance for a couple of years already. I loved my job back then. I mean, there's something about rushing out to help people that made me feel like I mattered. We covered a wide area, mostly dirt roads through the reserve, and the nights were usually peaceful. But that particular evening was anything but normal. We got a call about someone hurt on the outskirts of the reservation. The dispatcher mentioned strange injuries, deep scratches, and possible broken bones. They also said there were rumors going around about some kind of intruder, maybe an animal or something else. I remember glancing at my partner Joel as we loaded up. We were used to odd calls, but there was a different energy to this one. It felt like we were heading into something nobody fully understood. We left the main road and drove onto that dusty path that cut through thick patches of trees. The sky was moonless, and it felt like the darkness was piling in around us. A few minutes in, we heard this loud impact on the side of our ambulance. It was so strong that it made the whole vehicle swerve, and my heart jumped into my throat. Joel looked at me, eyes wide, asking if I saw anything. I flicked on the high beams, and for a second, just a split second, I thought I saw a shape dart off into the trees. It moved on 2 legs, but it wasn't a person, or if it was, they were incredibly fast. Neither of us said much, but I could feel my hands shaking on the steering wheel. We had to keep going, though, because someone out there was hurt. The radio chatter kept reminding us that time was critical, so we pushed on, ignoring every instinct that told us to turn around. My throat felt dry, adrenaline was pulsing, and all I could think about was how wrong everything felt. The forest was too quiet. Normally you'd hear crickets, maybe an owl, but there was nothing. When we got to the clearing, we found a small crowd of neighbors huddled together, all talking over each other. Some claimed they saw a huge, hairy creature lurking near the edge of the trees. They said it was upright, with a massive frame. Others thought it was some rabid wolf or bear. But the footprints they pointed out, those weren't normal animal tracks. They looked like clawed toes, way bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen, and spaced like a biped's stride. I don't know. I've seen wildlife injuries before, but this felt off the charts. We got out to check on the injured folks. One man had these long gashes on his arm that looked like they'd been made by very sharp claws. Another had bruises around his ribs, like something or someone had tried to crush him. Everyone looked terrified. I did my best to keep calm, as I was taught. You never want to let patients see you panic. But inside, my nerves were firing like crazy. We started loading people into the ambulance, and that's when it happened again. Something smacked the vehicle hard enough to rattle the doors. It sounded like fists pounding metal, only heavier, like an angry beast was trying to get in. The group outside scattered, screaming, and Joel shouted for everyone to hurry. I tried to keep focus and secure the stretcher. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it would burst. Once we managed to get everyone inside, I jumped back behind the wheel and revved the engine. We needed to find a safer spot to treat these injuries and call for more help. The second I started moving, that shape, or another one just like it, rushed across the road in front of us. It disappeared behind the trees, and then I heard a thump on the roof. I still don't know what that was. It felt like a heavy weight landing on top, then sliding off. The ambulance rocked, and I thought for sure it would tip over. Fighting the urge to slam on the brakes, I pressed the gas pedal as hard as I could. My only goal was to get to a well-lit area, maybe near the main road or somewhere we could radio for help. I could hear Joel in the back trying to keep the patients from being thrown around as we bounced over ruts in the dirt track. One of the wounded guys was half-conscious, moaning in pain. The whole scene felt like some nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Every few seconds, I'd catch glimpses of that thing in the trees. It was fast, staying parallel to us, ducking behind trunks and branches. My headlights would catch a flash of fur, or maybe skin. Honestly, it was too dark and happened too fast to be certain. But it was definitely something bigger than any person I'd encountered. As we made it onto a slightly wider stretch of road, I tried the radio to contact our dispatch. Nothing, just static. Joel tried as well, messing with the frequency, calling out codes for emergency backup, but it was like someone was jamming our signal. It gave me this sinking feeling, like we were on our own. Meanwhile, the pounding on the side of the ambulance started up again, then stopped, then started on the other side. It was like it was messing with us, circling around to keep us panicked. My mind was racing, searching for the nearest safe spot. There was an old gas station a few miles away, so I decided to head there. It had decent lighting and a payphone if the radio was dead. But as we tried to reach it, the creature seemed to anticipate our route. It appeared in front of us, darting between trees. My headlights caught what might have been an arm, long and hairy, but I'm not 100% sure. It was enough, though, that I swerved to avoid hitting it. The ambulance almost skidded off the road into a ditch. I could taste bile in the back of my throat from pure fear. Joel yelled that we should take the secondary route, a narrower dirt path that wasn't well maintained, but maybe it would throw off whatever was stalking us. So I made a sharp turn, and we bounced violently over potholes and rocks. The patients in the back cried out, and I shouted an apology to them. I just needed to keep us moving, keep us away from whatever was out there. We found ourselves surrounded by towering pines, the canopy so thick overhead that even the starlight seemed choked out. Everything outside the ambulance was pitch black, except for the sweep of our headlights. And in that darkness, I felt like we were being watched from every angle. My skin prickled, and my breath came in short gasps. At some point, we heard a piercing howl, or maybe it was more of a shriek. I've never heard anything like it, not before and not since. It echoed through the trees, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Joel and I looked at each other, and I could see raw fear in his eyes. We were supposed to be the cool-headed professionals, the ones who keep panic at bay, but in that moment, we were just as terrified as anyone else would be. Finally, after what felt like hours, though it might have been just minutes, the radio crackled to life. Another ambulance crew and a couple of police cars were on their way to us. I gave them our approximate location and told them about the creature, though I doubted they'd believe me. To my relief, the dispatcher sounded concerned enough that they were sending multiple units. We pulled onto a more recognizable stretch of road, and the tension in my chest eased just a fraction. The pounding on the ambulance had stopped abruptly, like the creature knew we weren't quite as isolated anymore. Or maybe it got bored, I don't know. We kept moving until we reached a crossroad that led to the main highway. That's where we finally saw red and blue flashing lights in the distance. I've never been so happy to see police cruisers. As soon as we slowed down, the noise, the presence, it all vanished. No more thuds, no more glimpses of movement in the trees. It was like someone flipped a switch, and the forest around us went back to being the quiet, eerie place it usually was. Officers and another ambulance team came up to check on us. Joel and I tried to explain what happened, but it felt ridiculous the second the words left my mouth. We pointed out the dents and scratches on the ambulance's exterior, though. Those were real enough. They did a brief search of the area, found some strange footprints, and a few broken branches way higher than a normal animal could reach. Nobody had a clear explanation. Some older locals started whispering about shapeshifters or werewolf-type creatures that show up every few generations. I'm not one for folklore, but I also can't deny what I saw, or at least what I think I saw. In the end, they took our patients to the nearest hospital, and we gave our statements to the police. I expected them to dismiss us as overworked or hysterical, but they seemed genuinely spooked by the footprints. We left it at that. I went home that night, but I hardly slept. My mind kept replaying the moment something slammed into the ambulance, or the glimpse of that figure darting just at the edge of the headlights. The weirdest part? After that night, everything went back to normal in Harvest Grove. Sure, people talked about it for a while, some believed, some laughed it off, but no one else reported seeing anything similar. The local council improved streetlights in some areas, set up volunteer patrols, and life just continued. Every once in a while, I'd catch rumors of another sighting, but nothing ever matched the intensity of what happened that night. I still think about those footprints and that uncanny feeling that something was tracking us, like it wanted to see how we'd react. It knew we were vulnerable, out there in the dark with injured people. I can't prove what it was. I can't say for sure if it was a freak of nature or some kind of twisted legend come to life. All I know is that for a few hours on that single night, it felt like we were in the middle of something that defied every explanation I'd ever heard, and just like it started, it stopped. 1 second it was there, slamming on our doors and howling in the woods, and the next, it was gone. We never found a solid answer, and I guess I've made my peace with that. But I'll never drive through those back roads at night again without remembering that terrible sense of being watched by something far beyond my understanding. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't just seeing the unknown, it's knowing it's out there somewhere and it could come back any time it wants. Story 9. I still get a knot in my stomach whenever I think about that night back in 1989. My name's Jima, And at the time I was just your average accountant, working for a firm that handled financial audits for a tribal casino near Marafield. It was the kind of job where most days are uneventful, just numbers and spreadsheets, you know. But I swear, that one evening changed everything I believed about what's really out there. I'd stayed late at the office to meet a tight deadline. By the time I wrapped up, it was past 11. The building was practically deserted, except for maybe 1 or 2 security guards on duty. My plan was simple: run to my car, drive home, and grab a few hours of shut-eye before starting again the next morning. But right from the moment I stepped out of the building, I felt this weird tension in the air. It wasn't cold exactly, but there was a wind that picked up suddenly and sent a chill right through me. I tried to brush it off as just being tired. As I walked across the lot, the exterior lights seemed dimmer than usual. My eyes kept darting around, and I realized my heart was pounding for no logical reason. Then I remembered something that had happened earlier that week. My colleague Louisa had come back from the parking area in the middle of the afternoon, looking pale as a sheet. She swore up and down she'd seen a huge silhouette with impossibly long arms lurking near the cars. She'd heard a strange noise too, like a clicking or a guttural croak. We all teased her, saying it could have been a trick of the light or maybe some tall tourist wandering around. But as I stood there alone that night, her story came rushing back to me, and it wasn't funny anymore. I tried to ignore that nagging sense of dread. I told myself, just keep moving, get to the car. But every step echoed in my ears. Then I heard it, a distinct snap of a twig or branch off to my left, near the line of trees separating the parking area from a wooded patch. I froze. I kept scanning with my eyes, but all I saw were dark shapes and shadows. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe a stray cat, maybe a deer, but it felt off. The whole place felt watched. I started walking faster, my keys already gripped in my hand. That's when I heard another snap, followed by a kind of rustling, like something big shifting around in the brush. I couldn't see it clearly, but my gut told me there was something there. My ears were straining to catch every sound. I wanted to call out, but I also didn't want to reveal exactly where I was if it turned out to be something that shouldn't be there. All of a sudden, I saw movement, just a slight shift at the edge of the light. It looked like a silhouette, unnaturally tall, hunched forward, with arms that seemed too long for its body. I had that split-second argument in my head. Am I actually seeing this, or has work stress finally broken me? But I wasn't imagining it. The shape moved again, almost gliding from one spot to another. Then it stopped, like it was sizing me up. My adrenaline kicked in, and I bolted for my car. I'm not in great shape, never was, but in that moment, I swear I sprinted like an Olympian. I fumbled with the door, got in, locked it, and started the engine, all in what felt like a single motion. My hands were shaking so badly that I had trouble turning the key. When the engine finally roared to life, I checked my mirrors. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, there it was, right in the rear view, illuminated just enough by my brake lights. A figure with elongated limbs, kind of half hidden behind another parked car. It looked almost human, except the proportions were twisted, like a stretched-out mannequin. The thing leaned forward, and I saw an arm reach along the side of the car it was behind. I couldn't make out a face, just this contorted silhouette. It didn't come any closer. Instead, it retreated in a fluid, unsettling way, back into the darkness. I felt my entire body go cold. It was like my brain couldn't process what I had just seen. Part of me wanted to get out and figure out what the hell it was, but my survival instinct was screaming, "Drive!" And drive I did. I tore out of there, practically burning rubber as I left the lot. My heart thudded so hard, I thought it might burst. It took me several minutes just to stop shaking enough that I could breathe normally. The weirdest part was, Once I was on the main road, it was dead quiet, almost peaceful. Streetlights shone on empty sidewalks, and no one was out. It was like the entire world was going on about its business, completely oblivious to what had just happened. I pulled over a couple miles away at a gas station, sat there with the engine running, and tried to rationalize. Could it have been a trick of the light or some kid messing around in a costume? But the more I replayed it in my head, the more certain I felt that it wasn't just a person. The proportions were too bizarre, and that movement, it was like nothing I'd ever seen. My mind went back to stories I'd heard, rumors around the casino about some creature or presence people spotted in the woods at night, things the local tribal community sometimes spoke about. Although no one had pinned down the exact legend, some called it a spirit, others a shapeshifter. Words like kurupir or something close to that had been tossed around in hushed tones. I never took any of it seriously until then. Eventually, I forced myself to drive home. I locked every door and window, double-checked them all, and just sat there in my living room wide awake. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured those elongated limbs slipping through the shadows. By morning, I was a wreck. I remember calling a co-worker, stammering through my story. He was silent for a moment. Then he told me that a security guard had found fresh footprints near the lot that very morning, barefoot but huge, with a kind of elongated shape. That freaked me out even more. I got a grip on myself enough to go back into work around noon that day, but I felt like the walls were closing in. Everyone was on edge. Turns out, a couple of other employees had come forward about seeing something lurking around the parking areas at night. One woman claimed it had left scratch marks on a fence near her car. Another said she heard this low clicking noise that got louder the closer she got to the building entrance. The security team was baffled. They increased their patrols, even set up some cameras, but I never heard about them catching anything solid. What scared me the most was that the creature, or whatever it was, seemed to vanish into thin air as soon as it wanted to. It didn't leave behind any real evidence except maybe those odd footprints, which could have been explained away by some trick or hoax if you were desperate enough to rationalize. But I know what I saw that night. And it wasn't just a person in a costume. I could feel the malice in its presence. I remember the hair on the back of my neck standing up, like my body sensed I was in danger before my mind fully registered it. After that day, everyone around the casino was talking about it. Some chalked it up to local folklore, others blamed it on wild animals, and a few folks swore there were clandestine experiments going on in the area. I don't know which theory is correct, if any. All I know is that for a split second, I saw something that completely defied what I believed was possible, and it left me with a fear that even now I can't totally shake. Strangely, after a few more nights of tense patrols and employees refusing to walk alone, the sightings stopped just as quickly as they started. No more footprints, no shadows skulking around. It was like this wave of terror passed through Marafield, left everyone rattled, and then vanished without a trace. Nobody ever got a definitive explanation, and to this day, whenever I think about it, I get that same knot in my stomach. I guess all I can say is that the world isn't as cut and dried as we want to believe. At least, that's the lesson I got out of it. I still don't have a clue what I actually witnessed. Part of me wants to forget the whole thing, but another part feels like maybe it's a warning that sometimes the unknown is right there in front of us, lurking just past the edge of the light. And if you're unlucky enough to see it, you'll never look at the dark the same way again. Story 10. I still remember that day in 1996 like it happened this morning. It was blazing hot in Clayfield Springs, and I was sweating through my uniform even before noon. I'd been working as a security guard in that native reserve park for a while, proud to keep things orderly and safe. Usually my job was pretty routine, making sure tourists stayed on the marked trails, picking up stray trash, checking that nobody messed with protected areas. But that afternoon was anything but normal. I was patrolling a quieter part of the park, not too far from a trailhead that few visitors used. The sun felt harsh on my neck, and the dry Arizona air made me constantly sip water. I got this crackly call on my radio about some belongings found abandoned near a less-traveled trail. Nothing totally unusual. Sometimes people would set their backpack down, wander off, and forget it. But something in the dispatcher's voice made me uneasy. There was an urgency that didn't quite match the typical lost and found scenario. Following protocol, I headed toward the spot described. It was tucked away past a cluster of tall pines and desert brush. Right away, I noticed bits of fabric snagged on branches, as if someone had run past in a hurry. Farther along, I found personal items scattered across the sandy ground, a water bottle, a torn sleeping bag, some clothing scraps that looked like they'd been ripped by force. My gut tightened. This didn't look like a simple case of someone forgetting their gear. I knelt down, pressing my fingers into these prints in the dirt that almost looked like footprints mixed with something else. The spacing was weird, the toes too spread out. I can't say I'm an expert in animal tracks, but I've seen my fair share of regular wildlife prints, and these just didn't match anything I'd ever encountered. Alarmed, I radioed in a report, explaining what I saw. Soon, two of my colleagues, a lawyer Red Crow and M. Stonehorse, showed up to help me comb the area. We stuck together, moving slowly. Every few steps we came across more signs of a struggle. Branches snapped in half and deeper footprints, some human, some not so human. We found an old, half-collapsed shelter against a rock face, with fresh scratch marks all over the wood, large gashes, as though something with massive claws had been swiping at it. If it was a bear or a puma, I would have recognized the pattern of the scratches. This looked entirely different. The air felt heavier. Even the insects and birds seemed to have vanished, leaving behind a tense hush. As we pushed deeper, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My skin prickled with that primal alertness, like when you're convinced there's a set of eyes on you from the dark. Then we heard it, a low, rumbling noise that seemed to echo all around. It sounded like a cross between a distorted growl and some kind of moan. We froze. I exchanged a quick glance with A. Lawyer and M. Stonehorse. None of us spoke out loud, but we all had the same question. What the hell was that? Slowly, we advanced, keeping our radios close in case we needed backup. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it in my ears. The growling picked up again, just briefly, and then died out. That's when we noticed a shape moving behind the trees, maybe 50 yards away. At first, I thought it might be a person wearing dark clothing, hunched low to the ground. But it moved in such an odd, fluid way, too fast, too graceful, and then it stood upright for a split second. I swear it looked half human and half animal, but I only caught a silhouette. My brain tried to piece it together. Was it a trick of the light? A shadow from some branches? But there was no mistaking how it disappeared behind those trees, vanishing in 2 or 3 long strides, almost like it leapt beyond our line of sight. We decided to follow. Not our smartest move, but we couldn't leave it at that. If there was a wounded camper or something predatory out there, it was our job to find answers. We spread out a bit, making sure we stayed within sight of each other. The sun was starting to dip, giving everything an orange cast that felt both beautiful and strangely ominous. The quiet was crushing. Even our footfalls seemed muffled in the sandy soil. We found more footprints heading deeper into the woods, and a few times I saw bent or scratched tree trunks, as if that thing had gripped the bark for support. We kept going until daylight almost vanished. I remember seeing the last rays of sun flickering through the branches. Everything turned a dark, rusty color, and that's when we heard a rasping breath, way too close for comfort. I swung my flashlight around, and the beam landed on a cluster of brush. I thought I saw something crouched there, maybe 6 feet tall if it stood up straight, but it was hunched forward, with these long arms pulled in. Before any of us could do a thing, it moved. God, it was so fast. I felt this surge of panic wash over me, like pure adrenaline slamming through my chest. I could hardly track where it went. It was just a blur of motion. I heard branches snapping and something heavy running off into the deeper woods. We stood there in stunned silence. A lawyer tried to gather his composure, and M. Stonehorse was breathing hard like he'd just sprinted for miles. None of us could quite say what we saw. It was definitely not a bear, not a puma, not any local wildlife we knew. If I'm honest, in the back of my mind, an old legend surfaced about shapeshifters or skinwalkers. But I'd always brushed off those stories as mythology. That night, though, everything felt possible. Realizing we were outmatched in the dark, we called it in. The local authorities told us to head back immediately. By the time we reached Clayfield Springs, word had already spread like wildfire that something was prowling the park. Folks started sharing rumors of red glowing eyes in the distance, or strange howls near campsites at night. Some of it sounded exaggerated, but it added another layer of tension to the situation. For the rest of that evening, I stayed around the ranger station, briefing search teams who arrived with dogs and better equipment. A lawyer and M. Stonehorse were just as rattled as I was. We couldn't quite explain what we'd seen. The dogs picked up a few weird scents and followed them for a while, but eventually lost the trail near a rocky outcrop. The place was eerily silent, except for the occasional chirp of nighttime insects. People in town whispered about the old stories, tales of creatures that could shift forms, blending human and animal traits. It felt surreal to think I might have just witnessed something like that firsthand. But all the evidence, those bizarre scratches, the footprints, the abandoned belongings, pointed to something beyond the ordinary. Eventually, the search teams had to call it quits for the night. We regrouped and made a plan to continue in the morning, but there was an unspoken fear that maybe this thing wouldn't be around by then, or worse, that it would and someone else might get hurt. There was talk of a curfew for campers, especially with so many families visiting that summer. I remember seeing the worry in people's faces, like they could sense that the park's peaceful facade had been shattered. And then, just like that, the night ended without any new sightings or attacks. By dawn, I felt an odd mix of relief and unresolved dread. Over the following days, there were scattered reports of unusual prints in the mud or distant howls, but we never found solid proof of what we'd encountered or where it went. The authorities kept a close watch for a while, telling tourists to stay in designated areas, especially after dark. A few folks claimed they saw something lurking just beyond their flashlights at night, but nothing was ever confirmed. I still think about that day a lot, how it started as a normal shift under a blistering sun and ended with me and my co-workers nearly face to face with something I can't even properly describe. Even now, I get chills remembering the way it moved, the guttural sound it made, and how those footprints in the dust were so unmistakably not human. It's like it appeared out of nowhere, caused a ripple of panic, and then vanished without a trace. All these years later, I don't have a neat conclusion. I haven't found any explanation that fits better than the old stories do. It just happened, then stopped, as abruptly as it started. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I replay those moments in my head, wondering if we really saw what we think we saw. And if we did, how many more like it are out there, slipping through the darkness where nobody expects it. I doubt I'll ever get real answers, but the memory is enough to remind me that there are things out there we can't fully understand, things that can slip between what we consider human and animal, real and unreal. And that one sweltering day in 1996, in the heart of Clayfield Springs, I came far too close to learning that firsthand. Story 11. I remember the exact date because it was my first week back on patrol after a short medical leave. It was 1999, and I was stationed in a small town called Foxwood Creek. Most days were quiet, maybe the occasional petty theft or a few noise complaints. I never thought I'd encounter anything beyond ordinary police work. That day started like any other. I did my morning rounds, filled out some paperwork, then grabbed a quick lunch at a local diner before heading out again. Around mid-afternoon, a call came through the radio about strange noises in an abandoned warehouse near the old reservation. Typically, I would have shrugged off something like that as kids messing around or an animal sheltering inside. But there was something in the dispatcher's voice that felt off, like they couldn't quite explain what the caller had reported. I decided to go see for myself. When I arrived, the place already gave me a bad vibe. The warehouse stood alone, with rust coating the walls and a huge metal door partially open. It was the kind of location you'd only see in horror stories, isolated, silent, and dimly lit by a sun that seemed to hide behind clouds just then. My cruiser was the only vehicle there, and I noticed how the wind died down the minute I got out. Everything felt unnervingly still. I approached the door, gun in the holster but unlatched, and called out to see if anyone needed help. No answer, just this ringing silence, made worse by the echo of my own footsteps on the concrete floor inside. The air smelled stale, like old dust and rotting wood. Flicking on my flashlight, I scanned the area. I saw broken furniture, a couple of rusted metal shelves, and piles of decaying boxes. Nothing unusual at first glance, but as I moved deeper inside, I noticed footprints, wide, misshapen tracks in the dust. They weren't boot prints, and they weren't quite animal either. It almost looked like someone or something had spread out its toes too far, leaving these weird claw marks in the dirt. My gut tightened, and I caught myself turning my flashlight around constantly, thinking I'd see a figure behind me. Then I heard it. A scraping sound, like nails or claws dragging across metal. It came from behind a stack of crates near the far wall. My heart started pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. I radioed in for backup, but the signal was crackly. I only managed to get part of my message out before it cut off. Static filled my earpiece, but I hoped at least the station understood something was wrong. I inched toward the crates, trying to keep my breathing steady. My flashlight beam trembled against the darkness. Suddenly, something burst from the shadows. A flash of fur, muscles, and a face that looked horrifyingly human, yet undeniably beast-like. The creature was large, easily taller than me, with hunched shoulders and thick limbs. Its eyes seemed to catch the light in a way that made my blood run cold, reflecting a predatory gleam. I froze, too terrified to pull my weapon for a second. It let out a guttural snarl that made every hair on my neck stand up. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my radio to warn dispatch, but the static was so heavy that all I managed to shout was something like, something's, before it cracked off again. The creature lunged toward a side entrance, its body moving in quick, jerky motions. On its way out, it scraped these impossibly deep grooves into the wall, almost like it was marking its territory. Then it tore through the metal door as if it were made of tin foil and bolted outside. I stood there, flashlight shaking, trying to process what I'd just seen. My mind raced with possibilities. Bear, wolf, a person in some monstrous costume, but nothing fit. I'd heard old legends around Foxwood Creek about shapeshifters or lupine spirits, but I never believed any of it. And yet, in that moment, I could feel my old skepticism crumbling. There was just no rational explanation. Maybe 10 minutes later, felt like an eternity, backup arrived. I must have been in shock because I remember jumping when my colleague touched my shoulder. They asked if I was hurt, but all I could do was point to the massive claw marks in the metal door and along the walls. I tried to describe the thing I'd seen, but the words sounded absurd even as they left my mouth. Half of me expected them to laugh or dismiss it, but when they saw those marks and the huge footprints in the dust, nobody was joking. We spread out around the warehouse and the surrounding lot, looking for any trace of the creature. The fence behind the building had been bent outward, as if something heavy forced its way through. There were tufts of matted fur stuck to jagged pieces of the fence wire. One of the officers gathered them into a plastic evidence bag. The rest of us tried to track the footprints, but they disappeared near a patch of dense weeds and rocks. More reinforcements arrived, including a couple of seasoned officers who'd grown up in Foxwood Creek. They exchanged uneasy glances, muttering how the old stories might be true. One of them recalled his grandfather's warnings about a spirit who took on the form of a wolf man during certain nights. Hearing that, I got chills. I'd always dismissed folklore as fun, but fictional. After witnessing what I did, I couldn't brush it off anymore. We spent the next hours combing every inch of the property. It was that kind of tension where you feel something could jump out at any second. Even the bravest guys on the force had this grim look on their faces. Despite our efforts, we found no fresh clues, no blood, no sign of a lair, nothing. It was like the thing had vanished into thin air. But the damage left behind, the twisted metal, the claw marks, those bizarre footprints, proved it was there, at least for that brief window of time. Eventually, we called it for the night. I remember sitting in my patrol car afterwards, hands still shaking on the steering wheel. The radio chatter was full of confusion, fear, and a scramble to figure out our next move. The higher-ups planned to interview nearby residents, send in hair samples for lab tests, and keep officers on alert. But none of that calmed me down. I had seen something that shouldn't exist, and no training had ever prepared me for that. I barely slept when I got home. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured its face, those elongated features, the dark matted fur, and those intense eyes. The next day, I learned that the lab results on the fur were inconclusive. They couldn't identify it as any known local species. For a time, folks in Foxwood Creek were extra cautious. There were nightly patrols and warnings issued to stay indoors after dark. Some people believed us. Others thought it was a hoax or a misidentified animal. But no one could explain the physical evidence we'd found. As for me, I never saw that creature again. Nobody did, as far as I know. It was like it appeared out of nowhere, tore through that warehouse, and vanished without a trace. Even the local legends didn't provide any concrete answers. They only fueled speculation that something old and wild had been awakened briefly. I'm still not sure what to think. I got through the rest of my time on the force without running into anything remotely like that again. But the memory is always there. To this day, I can't walk past old abandoned buildings without feeling a shiver in my spine, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows. I can't explain what I saw, and I don't pretend to have any theories that tie it all up nicely. All I know is that on that quiet afternoon in 1999, I came face to face with something I can't rationalize, and just as quickly as it arrived, it disappeared, leaving more questions than answers, and a lingering fear that maybe it's still out there, waiting for the right moment to show itself again. Story 12. I still remember that afternoon in 1994, like it happened yesterday. I was doing my usual supply run to the park near Highmont, something I'd done 100 times before. My route took me past a small indigenous community, then onto a narrow gravel road that led to the park's support station. Everything felt routine. Same old truck, same familiar checkpoints, until I got a call from Serena, my co-worker who monitored the trail cameras. She sounded uneasy, which wasn't like her at all. Serena was usually calm, the type who'd walk into any situation with a clear head. She told me there was some footage I needed to see as soon as I arrived. I didn't think much of it at first. Could have been an injured animal, maybe a bear too close to the visitors. But her tone stuck with me. It was the kind of voice people use when they've seen something that makes no sense. When I pulled up to the support station, Serena was already waiting outside. She had one of those portable video players with her, and she motioned me to follow her inside. She barely even said hello. That's when I got a bad feeling. Serena's eyes had this nervous intensity, like she'd been replaying the same disturbing scene for hours. She showed me the footage. The camera angle was from one of the higher points on the trail, overlooking a wide clearing. It wasn't high quality, but it was enough to see movement. There was something crossing the frame, humanoid, but elongated, almost stretched out. It darted from one side to the other so fast it was a blur. At first, I tried to tell myself it had to be a wolf or a big elk, and maybe the camera was distorting the shape. But in my gut, I knew it wasn't any normal animal I'd seen out there. Serena told me she checked the timestamps on the recordings and realized this thing had been caught by multiple cameras over a wide area, always at the edges, never in the center of the shot. She wanted to investigate the place where the last sighting occurred, about a mile into the deeper part of the woods. The park was open to visitors, so we couldn't risk ignoring a possible threat. I offered to go with her because we both knew the trails well, and I had a rifle in the truck just in case we ran into something aggressive. We geared up with flashlights, a pair of binoculars, and I took my rifle. As we walked, the woods felt heavier than usual. I'd been on that path countless times, delivering supplies to different outposts, but the atmosphere that day was suffocating. The crunch of branches under our boots echoed, and every shift in the canopy overhead made us jerk our heads up. After about 20 minutes, Serena paused. She pointed to a spot on the ground where there were these long, deep drag marks, like something had been pulled across the dirt. I remember crouching down to touch the disturbed earth. The grooves were too wide for a human foot, and there was no sign of wheels or anything like that. It looked more like claw marks, or maybe something was scraping the ground as it was dragged. My stomach tightened. We pressed forward, following the marks. Further along we saw more signs, bushes torn apart, small saplings bent at odd angles, and pieces of ripped fabric caught in the branches. The color of the cloth was faded, like it had been out there for a while, but the edges were fresh enough to look recently torn. Serena and I kept exchanging glances, neither of us saying much because we didn't want to spook each other more than we already were. We found some monitoring equipment damaged too, little devices used to track animals' heart rates and movements. They'd been ripped apart like they were nothing. Metal pieces were twisted, wires yanked out. I'd never seen an animal do something like that before. It felt deliberate, like someone or something didn't want those devices there. That's when we heard it. The snapping of branches came in a sequence, moving closer. It wasn't just a random noise. It sounded like something big was stepping on sticks one after another, almost circling us. My heart started pounding so loud I felt it in my ears. Serena gripped my arm, and I raised the rifle trying to scan the trees. Then I saw a shape. At first, it was just a glimpse of a tall figure, half hidden behind a thick trunk. I couldn't make out a face, just long limbs and dark, messy fur, or hair, I'm still not sure. It shifted, then moved in this unnerving way, almost gliding between the trees. I felt this wave of pure terror, like my body telling me to run, but my brain was too busy trying to understand what I was looking at. It let out a low, guttural growl that rumbled through the clearing. I remember every hair on my neck standing up. Serena squeezed my shoulder so hard I could feel her nails even through my jacket. We both knew we weren't prepared to face whatever this thing was. So we made a silent agreement with just one look. We had to get out of there. We started backing away slowly, but the creature seemed to notice. I felt the adrenaline spike in my veins, and we broke into a run. Every part of me was screaming that we shouldn't turn our backs, but staying there felt even worse. As we sprinted, I kept turning around to see if it was coming after us. It was. I caught flashes of it moving, covering ground much faster than any normal animal. The undergrowth rustled violently behind us, and I could hear these harsh, almost snarling breaths. My rifle felt like a toothpick in my hands. I fired one warning shot into the air, hoping it would scare the creature off, but the noises kept coming, closing the distance between us. My lungs were burning, and I tripped over roots more than once. At one point, Serena nearly lost her footing, and I grabbed her arm to keep her upright. We kept going until we broke into a small clearing, which was the only spot where we could possibly signal for help. Serena had a small flare in her pack, an emergency signal we carry in case we get separated from the main group or if we need search and rescue. She fired it straight up. The red spark arced into the grey sky, and for a moment, everything seemed still. The creature paused at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees. I could see its arm, long, hairy, bent at an unnatural angle. It let out another low growl, but it didn't move into the open space. We locked eyes with it for a fraction of a second, though eyes is a strong word, because I only saw dark hollows where eyes should have been. I don't know if my memory is exaggerating or if it was that dark under the canopy, but it still gives me nightmares. Within minutes, though it felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of our patrol vehicles. Rangers came rushing in, headlights cutting through the thick foliage. The roar of their engines and the sudden flood of lights seemed to scare the creature off. It retreated so fast, I almost doubted it was really there. But the destruction around us proved that something had been. Broken branches, the smell of damp earth, the lingering sense that we'd come way too close to something we weren't supposed to see. When the rangers found us, we must have looked like we'd seen a ghost. Serena was shaking so badly she could barely speak. I was out of breath, dizzy, trying to explain in short bursts what happened. We showed them the marks, the shredded equipment, and I told them exactly where we saw that figure. They scattered to search the perimeter, but I knew in my gut they wouldn't find anything. Whatever it was long gone. After we made it back to the station, the supervisors decided to shut down some of the secondary trails, at least until they figured out what was out there. Officially, they said it was to ensure visitor safety after multiple reports of a large predator. Unofficially, everyone was swapping stories about strange sightings, bizarre footprints, and half-seen shapes in the woods. I heard rumors that some people in the nearby indigenous community had legends of creatures in the forest, old stories they rarely shared with outsiders. I never got a straight answer from anyone, though. And honestly, I'm not sure I want one. Part of me doesn't ever want to know exactly what we encountered. It was beyond anything I've experienced before. Even now, all these years later, I still think about it. Sometimes, I'll be driving alone at night, and if the wind rustles the trees just right, my mind goes straight back to that clearing, the moment that thing locked eyes with us, and the absolute dread I felt. It's like a permanent stamp on my memory, proof that there's still so much we can't explain. After that day, I continued my job, but I never felt the same sense of safety. Every snap of a branch in the distance put my nerves on edge. And to this day, I can't walk through thick woods without expecting to see that silhouette slip behind a tree, dragging something away, leaving me with more questions than answers. I don't have a satisfying explanation for what happened. Nothing about it makes sense to me even now. All I know is that for one afternoon in 1994, the ordinary rules of the forest broke, and whatever crossed our path in those woods, it never fully left my mind. I can still feel it, lingering in the back of my thoughts, reminding me that sometimes things just appear and vanish with no warning, and we're left with only our nightmares to fill in the gaps. Story 13. I still remember the exact date, October 13th, 1992. It was a grey afternoon at the Sawmill in Crimson Rock. I clocked in early, feeling a bit tired but ready for another routine day. Back then, my main job was pretty straightforward. Cut the logs, stack them, and make sure everything ran smoothly. There were always rumors about weird sightings near the forest, especially from the indigenous village next to us, but I never took them seriously. I was the type who'd say, "Nothing strange ever happens on my shift." That was before that day. Around midday, I was finishing up a batch of wood when I heard a loud crash echo through the yard. It startled me enough that I nearly dropped the saw from my hand. My first thought was that maybe a truck had backed into something, but when I walked over, I saw complete chaos. Wooden pallets shoved aside, steel beams bent in ways I still don't understand, and our big sign, the one with the sawmill's name, cracked right down the middle. There were deep grooves in the dirt that looked almost like claw marks, spaced too far apart to be from normal animals. It was like something massive had stomped around, then vanished without leaving a clear trail. I called out to my co-workers, and a few of them gathered around. Everyone looked just as stunned as I was. Even the foreman, who'd seen pretty much every kind of accident, was speechless. We started scanning for footprints, tire tracks, any sign of a human intruder, or a normal animal at least. But everything was random and scrambled, like something inhuman had torn through the yard, then disappeared. I was trying to keep calm, but deep down I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. By late afternoon, word had spread. People were theorizing about vandals, maybe local kids playing a sick prank. But the damage was too severe to be a bunch of teenagers messing around. Some folks brought up the old stories, giant creature sightings in the woods, legends from the nearby tribe about forest spirits that protected the land. I'd always rolled my eyes at those tales. But seeing how the metal benches were literally twisted made me start to question everything I thought I knew. We decided to check the security cameras, which were newly installed around the perimeter. The footage was bizarre. One camera showed a shadow, something tall, moving on two legs, darting between stacks of lumber. Then the screen glitched, and by the time it came back, the yard was in shambles. It's frustrating because it feels like the glitch was no coincidence. It's almost like whatever passed by shorted the camera or knew how to avoid being caught clearly on film. I was getting antsy. I told my supervisor I'd stay after hours to do a walkthrough of the property. A few other guys agreed to join in. We grabbed our flashlights, some old lanterns, and walked in a group, hoping to spot any signs of trespassers. But as evening fell, the place got eerily quiet. The wind picked up, rustling the trees at the edge of the sawmill. It was that kind of wind that carries strange echoes, making you feel like something's breathing right behind you. Around 7 p.m., just as the sun was dipping below the treetops, we heard this deep, rumbling growl. It wasn't like a normal animal sound. I've heard bears grunt and moan, and this was entirely different. It had a resonance to it, like it was coming from a chest twice the size of any creature I'd ever seen. Everyone froze, shining our flashlights into the dark. The sound came again, louder this time. We couldn't pinpoint the direction, which made it even worse. My heart was hammering in my chest. I tried to keep my composure, but my hands were shaking so badly that the beam of my flashlight kept trembling. Suddenly, one of the guys pointed to the far corner of the yard. We all turned, and for a split second, I saw a tall silhouette, a figure so large it looked unnatural. It moved behind a stack of timber, and then it was gone. We ran over, but we didn't find anything, except fresh claw marks on the wooden beams. They were about an inch deep, carved in a pattern that resembled giant fingers. Whatever made those marks had to have incredible strength. That's when I felt genuine fear course through me for the first time in my life. Every hair on my arm stood up. I felt like we were trespassing on something else's territory, which made no sense because we were the ones who worked there every day. My rational side tried to brush it off as a big bear, or maybe a large cat. But the footprints we found, long, broad footprints with toes that looked more human than animal, didn't back up that theory. We decided to regroup near the maintenance shed, where an old empilhadera, forklift, was stored. We kept the lights on in that area, figuring it would keep any wild animal away. We stood there, talking in hushed voices, debating if we should call local law enforcement or maybe even the tribal elders for guidance. And then, out of nowhere, came the loudest metallic crash I've ever heard in my life. It was like a car wreck, but more visceral. We spun around to see the forklift flipped upside down, wheels in the air. Our hearts nearly stopped. How could that happen in a matter of seconds, right behind us, without us noticing any movement? We rushed forward and discovered deep, claw-like scratches gouged into the sides of the machine. The forklift's canopy was crushed, as if it had been squeezed by enormous hands. I still can't comprehend the kind of force it would take to flip something that heavy so effortlessly. At that point, a few guys were on the verge of panic, yelling that we needed to get the hell out of there. Some started sprinting back toward the main building. My pulse was racing, and I was tempted to run too. But a strange mix of terror and responsibility made me stay. I needed to see this through. I kept thinking, what if this thing goes after one of us? We heard that same guttural growl again, echoing off the stacks of lumber. It sounded closer this time, and it vibrated through my bones. I felt trapped, like we were being watched from every angle. The lights we had set up weren't comforting anymore. Instead, they cast weird shadows that made everything look twisted and unnatural. My throat went dry, and I could hardly swallow. I forced myself to take a few steps forward, shining my flashlight around. That's when I spotted something snagged on the barbed wire fence near the perimeter, tufts of thick, dark hair. I grabbed a piece of it and felt my stomach churn. It was coarse and smelled like damp earth and rotting leaves. I've worked around animals and fur before, but this was different, like it belonged to a species I'd never heard of. Before I could yell for the others, the lights flickered and went out for a moment. In the split second of darkness, I thought I heard heavy footsteps rushing away, followed by a low grunt. When the lights came back on, everything was silent. It was as if the entire sawmill was holding its breath. The forklifts, the stacked wood, the tools, everything just looked abandoned under those flickering lamps. We combed the yard for another hour, practically jumping at every sound. But that was it. The chaos stopped as quickly as it had started. We were left with twisted metal, scattered debris, and claw marks as reminders that something powerful had been there. By the time we finally regrouped inside, it was past midnight, and everyone was pale and shaken. I stood there, hands still trembling, staring at the flipped forklift in disbelief. Nobody could explain what happened that day. We had pieces of evidence, a couple frames from the security footage, those horrifying claw marks, the hair on the fence, but none of it made real sense. The local wildlife experts we consulted later said it was unlike anything they'd studied. People brought up myths of Sasquatch, forest spirits, or some undiscovered predator, but there was no concrete conclusion. The management tried to tighten security, installed brighter floodlights, brought in more cameras. Yet to this day, no one can say for sure what tore through our yard that afternoon and evening. After that, I never laughed off the old stories again. I started taking the tribal legends more seriously. There are things out there we can't explain, things that don't care if we believe in them or not. People asked me if I'd ever seen the creature again, but I honestly couldn't handle another night shift like that. I still get chills just thinking about the forklift flipped upside down and those deep, ragged claw marks etched into the wood. It wasn't natural, and I doubt I'll ever have a proper explanation for it. All I know is that on that one day in October 1992, something came out of the forest and showed us just how vulnerable we really are. One moment, I was a skeptic, rolling my eyes at folklore. The next, I was standing in the middle of a disaster zone, heart pounding, swallowing my disbelief. And then, just like it began, it stopped. No final showdown, no dramatic confrontation, just an unsettling silence left behind. I still can't wrap my head around it, and I guess I never will. Story 14. I still remember that afternoon in 1993 like it happened yesterday. I'd been a wildlife tracker in Stony Pines for a few years, so I knew the trails and animal patterns like the back of my hand. That day, I got word from the visitor center that a group of travelers had seen something out of the ordinary on one of the lesser-known trails. They said they'd watched a herd of deer suddenly bolt like they were being chased. Normally, I'd dismiss that as wolves or a bear, but I decided to investigate anyway. Something about their faces, how spooked they were, told me this wasn't just an overreaction. I packed my gear and headed out right after lunch. The sky was completely clear, the kind of day that lets you see every shadow in the woods. I followed the main path until I reached a narrow offshoot that most visitors ignore because it's more rugged. Sure enough, I found all these prints, confused and overlapping, as if the deer had started running in every direction. I saw snapped branches and this strange smear on the ground. It was dark, not quite like dried blood, but it looked like something had impacted the earth there. My gut was telling me something was off, so I moved in closer to get a better look. The first thing I noticed was a bunch of broken twigs right around knee level. Whatever came through was tall enough that it snapped branches higher than a typical predator would. Then, maybe a few feet away, I found these odd clumps of fur. At first I thought it belonged to a deer that got injured, but when I picked it up, it felt thicker and coarser. Honestly, I couldn't match it with any animal I was familiar with, which was already unsettling. It felt unnatural, almost wiry, and it clung to the branches like it had been violently ripped out. I kept going deeper into the brush, following what looked like partial prints, just these big, heavy imprints in the dirt. The weird thing was that they seemed almost shaped like a human foot, but larger, and on some of them, I swear I saw marks at the ends like elongated claws. It sent a chill down my spine because no bear or mountain lion leaves prints like that. A couple of times, I thought I heard low rustling in the distance, but the woods can play tricks on your ears, especially when you're on edge. Not too far ahead, I found more spots where branches had been snapped off. You know how old branches leave that lighter, fresh break. It was like something big was forcing its way through the densest sections of forest. I started thinking about calling Keem and Marcel, my buddies who also worked in the reserve, but I wanted to get more evidence first. I felt an anxious pit in my stomach, yet curiosity was pushing me forward. I kept going until I reached a small clearing. Usually this spot is calm. Sometimes I'd see a deer or two grazing there. But it was totally silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. That's when I saw movement on the far side of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light because I'd been so jumpy. But I caught a glimpse of something tall, hunched over, shifting behind a thick pine tree. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But it moved in a way I can only describe as deliberate, like it knew I was there. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear my own pulse. I crouched low, hiding behind some shrubs. The sunlight was shining through the branches, and I saw a flash of what looked like a silhouette, long limbs and these gleaming claws at the ends of its hands. They weren't huge like swords, but definitely more noticeable than a regular animal's claws. The strangest part was how quickly it darted between the trees. One moment it was peeking around, the next it was gone, leaving no trace except for the faintest crunch of needles underfoot. Every instinct told me to run back, but part of my job is tracking, so I tried to follow it from a safe distance. I'm not exactly slow, and I know every shortcut in that area, but it moved with this unnatural speed, gliding through the woods like it was part of the environment itself. I'd lose sight of it, and then catch a glimpse again, always just out of reach. Eventually, it led me into a small ravine. By that point, my lungs were burning from trying to keep up. The ground there was muddy, so I figured I'd see clear footprints. I knelt down to check, but all I found were deep impressions, too big to be human, too narrow to be any animal I knew. And in some spots, the prints looked like they pressed so hard that the ground had caved in around them. At that moment, I felt this sudden rush of panic, like I wasn't alone. I jerked my head up, and sure enough, on the ridge above me, there it was again. A tall figure, slightly crouched, just watching. Even though the sunlight was hitting from behind, I could see the silhouette of those elongated limbs. That's when I realized how quiet everything was. Not a single bird call, no rustle of leaves, nothing. It was like we were in some vacuum of sound, me and whatever that thing was. My chest felt tight, and I remember thinking, I might not get out of this if it decides to come at me. We locked eyes, or at least I think we did, because I sensed it staring right at me. Then, in one swift motion, it turned and bolted up the ridge, disappearing behind the rocks. It didn't move like a human or an animal. It was too fluid, too quick. Without thinking twice, I scrambled back up the ravine and raced in the direction of the main trail. My heart was thumping, and my legs felt like jelly, but I kept going until I reached a spot where I had a bit of cell reception. Those old big cell phones were tough, but they worked sometimes. I tried calling Keem, but the signal kept dropping. By the time I got back to the center of the reserve, it was late afternoon. I showed the fur I'd collected to Marcel and Keem, and they looked as baffled as I was. One of them joked that it had to be from some skinwalker legend, but the looks on their faces told me they were just as spooked as I was. We decided to go back at dusk to see if we could spot it again. I can't deny I was terrified, but I felt this need to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. So we geared up, flashlights and all, and headed back to that clearing. The second we arrived, I could feel that same unsettling silence. We poked around, scanning the trees, but the thing never showed up. We found fresh markings on some tree trunks, though, long claw-like scratches maybe 4 or 5 feet off the ground. None of us had a good explanation. We were all too freaked out to stay until midnight, so we left before it got too dark. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept picturing those twisted footprints and that silhouette vanishing into the trees. The strangest thing was that after that day, reports trickled in of weird howling and odd sightings, but nothing as direct as what I experienced. Whenever I tried to find actual evidence, it was always half-traces, broken branches, partial prints, strange tufts of fur. It was like this creature was toying with me. Over the weeks that followed, people around Stony Pines stayed cautious, especially after sundown. I kept patrolling, but the sightings died down, almost as if the thing just left. To this day, I can't fully explain what I saw. Some folks say it was just a bear or a cougar, but I know what I saw wasn't any regular animal, and it definitely wasn't a person pulling a prank in a costume, not with those footprints and the way it moved. It all started and ended in that single afternoon, like it was here for a brief moment to remind me how little I actually understand about the world around us. I haven't found any answers, and maybe I never will. All I know is that whatever lurks out there in the deeper parts of the forest isn't something I ever want to come face to face with again. Story 15. I still remember the date, late fall of 1998. Nights in Elmwood Trace got really cold, and the roads out near the native reserve were practically empty after sundown. I was a volunteer paramedic back then, driving an old ambulance with minimal equipment, but it was enough for most emergencies in that remote area. I'd done a few midnight call-outs before, but nothing prepared me for what happened that night. I got a call about a group of people who'd apparently been injured in some accident. The dispatcher sounded uncertain. There weren't many details, just that they were in the woods, near a dirt road, about a half-hour drive from town. I figured it was an off-road camping trip gone wrong, or maybe a run-in with local wildlife. That kind of call wasn't too strange in Elmwood Trace, considering we had bears and wolves in the area. The drive was longer than expected. Everything felt eerily quiet, more than usual. My headlights illuminated narrow patches of trees on either side, and I noticed how the branches looked twisted under the moonlight, almost like bony fingers reaching inwards. I tried to keep my mind on the job, but an odd feeling crept up on me. I chalked it up to fatigue. Those late shifts often did that. When I reached the spot, I saw about 4 or 5 people huddled close to the roadside, waving me down. Even with the harsh beam of my headlights, I could tell they were in rough shape. Cuts, bruises, twisted ankles. It was odd that they were all scattered like that, as though they'd been running in different directions. One guy's shirt was torn across the chest, deep scratches visible on his skin. Another was limping, and her face was streaked with dirt or maybe dried blood. They looked shaken and confused, glancing back at the darkness behind them. They kept mentioning something large in the woods. A few claimed it was some kind of oversized wolf or a bear. Someone else insisted it had a shape unlike any normal animal, more upright, but still fast and powerful. I remember trying to calm them down while I cleaned a particularly nasty cut on the woman's arm. She said she'd barely seen it in the moonlight, just fur and teeth. Normally, I would have assumed it was a frightened exaggeration, maybe a panic response. Still, the way they all spoke with trembling voices and darting eyes put me on edge. I was grabbing more supplies from the ambulance's side compartment when suddenly something rammed into the vehicle. The impact was loud, a metallic thud that vibrated the entire frame. My hand jerked, and I nearly spilled the gauze I was holding. One of the injured men screamed, and another limped behind me, clinging to my arm. It wasn't just a random bump. It felt calculated, like some huge creature had slammed itself into the ambulance. I spun around, but saw only a dark shape vanishing among the trees. For a few seconds, I just stood there, heart hammering in my chest. I tried to radio for backup, but I got nothing but static. Normally, I'd get a signal, even weak, but this time there was no clear response. Everyone was huddled closer to the ambulance, looking around like they expected something else to leap out at them. We were in the middle of nowhere, and the sense of isolation really started to sink in. My mind was racing. An animal that big could come back, and with these people already injured, we'd be completely vulnerable. I rushed to get everyone inside the ambulance. There wasn't much space, but I told them to squeeze in as best as they could. One of them had started to hyperventilate, crying that it would come back, that it was watching us. I tried to keep everyone calm, but honestly, I felt that same cold fear settling in my stomach. I've seen bear attacks. What was described didn't quite match up. Wolves usually hunt in packs, but they'd rarely ram a vehicle. This felt different, like it wasn't just wild instinct, but something else. Despite the fear, my first duty was to get these folks to the nearest medical outpost, so I hopped into the driver's seat and started the engine. I drove carefully at first, trying not to jostle the patients, but then I noticed shadows flickering among the trees. It looked like multiple figures darting between the branches, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. Every time I caught a glimpse, it vanished before I could get a clear look. My adrenaline spiked. I pressed down on the gas, desperate to put distance between us and whatever was out there. Inside the ambulance, a couple of them started whispering about seeing glowing eyes outside the windows. At one point, the guy nearest the back door shouted that something was right outside, staring in. I glanced in the side mirror, and for a split second, I swore I saw two bright, reflective eyes in the darkness. The ambulance lurched as I involuntarily eased off the gas, my hands trembling on the wheel. It was so absurd that I nearly doubted my own eyes, but it was real enough to send a chill through my entire body. We sped along that narrow dirt road, bumping over rocks and potholes. Now and then, we'd hear weird snarling or growling from somewhere off to the side, like we were being chased by a pack of huge animals. But whenever I tried to pinpoint the source, it was gone. The tension was overwhelming. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Eventually, in the distance, I caught sight of headlights approaching. For the first time that night, I felt a surge of relief. Additional rescue vehicles had finally arrived. They must have picked up the tail end of my broken radio calls. We slowed to meet them. With more vehicles there, the surroundings suddenly felt less threatening. I didn't hear any more growls, and no shadows seemed to be pacing us. It was like the presence in the woods backed off as soon as it sensed more people around. I parked the ambulance on the side of the road, and a couple of other rescuers came over to check on us. I was shaking and short of breath, but tried to keep my composure. The group of injured folks started pouring out their story again, how they'd been out there, heard strange noises, then saw those massive shapes. Some of the rescue team went to investigate around the area, but they didn't find anything concrete, just crushed undergrowth, snapped branches, and what looked like unusual paw prints. No blood traces from an animal or any other sign that would prove an actual attack. While the other rescuers tried to piece things together, I focused on transporting the injured to the medical outpost in Elmwood Trace. The entire ride back, nobody said a word. They just looked at each other with wide eyes, occasionally wincing in pain, but clearly more shaken by fear. My nerves were still on high alert, expecting another impact against the side of the ambulance at any moment. But nothing happened. When we got back, I helped the staff do a quick assessment of everyone's injuries. They had bruises, cuts, and a few deeper gashes that seemed more like claw marks than typical scrapes. None of it made sense. A bear could do that theoretically, but the stories of multiple creatures and those strange glowing eyes gave me the creeps. People around town started whispering about large wolves or something more sinister. I heard rumors about werewolves and hybrids, but I wasn't one to jump to that conclusion. Still, that night definitely made me question what exactly was out there in those dark woods. The local authorities tried to investigate over the next few days, but no one found a thing besides a few faint tracks in the mud and some snapped tree limbs. No sightings, no fresh footprints, nothing. Eventually, people lost interest and chalked it up to a bear or some local legend. But I can't shake how deliberate it all felt, like something was stalking us, testing our defenses, but never fully attacking again after that initial scare. I still can't explain any of it, and honestly, I don't try to anymore. Whatever it was remains a mystery, and I haven't been back to that section of the reserve since. Even now, thinking about that thud on the ambulance and the sight of those glowing eyes sets my heart racing. It all happened so fast and then just stopped, like a nightmare that ends suddenly, leaving you disoriented and uneasy. A part of me wants to believe it was just one freak incident with an aggressive animal, but deep down, I know there's more to that night than I'll ever be able to prove. To this day, I haven't found a logical explanation for what I saw or what those people experienced. The feeling of being watched in those woods was more intense than anything I've felt before or since. It's like the forest itself was hiding something, Something that chose to reveal just enough to scare the living daylights out of us and then slip back into the darkness. I don't think I'll ever forget it. And if I'm being honest, a small part of me hopes I never fully understand what was out there, because the reality might be even more terrifying than the mystery. Story 16. I'll never forget that morning back in 1991. I'd been working at the Shadowbend Park for a while, mostly patrolling the trails and checking on the wildlife. It was my routine, getting up before sunrise, listening to birds chirping and breathing in that crisp forest air. Shadowbend wasn't exactly famous or anything, but the locals loved it. We had these rolling hills covered in thick forest, plus a native reservation area that was supposed to be protected. I took that part of my job seriously. That day started off like any other. I set out to do my usual round, expecting nothing more than maybe a fallen branch or some trash left behind by careless visitors. But as soon as I got deeper into the woods, I noticed something off. Several trees up ahead looked like they had branches twisted around each other, almost as if someone had forcibly bent them. My first thought was wind damage, maybe a small but intense gust that hit only that patch. Still, it felt strange because the rest of the forest looked completely untouched. I moved closer and saw that these branches weren't just broken or snapped. They were literally wrenched around, like someone took each limb and twisted it until it nearly cracked. I remember my heart pounding as I ran my fingers over the splintered edges. It was like the wood had been under an extreme amount of pressure, more than any animal I knew could manage. Right there, I decided to call in my co-workers. They were as puzzled as I was, especially when they discovered claw-like marks around the base of the trees. They were huge, wide and shallow, like something with massive talons had dragged them across the bark. The rest of the morning felt tense. Word spread among the team that an unidentified animal might be moving through our forest. We had black bears around sometimes, but their claw marks never looked like this, too large, too far apart. People started murmuring about some big cat or something out of place, but in my gut, I knew it wasn't a normal predator. Around midday, one of my colleagues, a friend who'd been working in the park almost as long as me, said she saw something high in the canopy. She called it a weird shape, human-like but taller and with disproportionately long arms. She'd only caught a glimpse of it before it vanished into the foliage, but she was badly shaken. I could see it in her eyes. Her words made everyone edgy. I decided I had to see for myself. I broke away from the group and climbed this small rocky outcrop that overlooked a good chunk of the forest canopy. The climb wasn't particularly steep, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Sweat gathered at my temples, and a dull panic crept over me. Still, I needed that vantage point. Once on top, I shielded my eyes from the sun and scanned the treetops. There were moments when I thought I saw movement, a dark blur darting from branch to branch, but it was too quick to lock onto. The leaves rustled gently, and occasionally I swore I saw a shape slip between the thick branches. It was enough to leave my stomach in knots. Ever since I started working in Shadowbend, the local elders would share old legends about spirits and guardians of the forest. Words like Wendigo got tossed around in those stories, creatures with warped forms, always tied to old, dark corners of the woods. I'd laughed them off before, but standing there on that ledge, I couldn't get those myths out of my head. By late afternoon, we decided to rope off the area to prevent curious hikers from stumbling in. It wasn't an official closure, just a temporary measure while we tried to figure out what the hell was happening. The other rangers and I prepared for a night patrol with flashlights and radios. We usually didn't do night patrols, but this situation felt serious. And honestly, I was torn between fear and a weird fascination. Part of me wanted to see whatever it was with my own eyes. if only to confirm I wasn't imagining things. Dusk fell quickly. I remember how the temperature dropped, and the forest sounds seemed to change. Crickets and owls took over, but there was also something else, an occasional low thud, like someone hitting a tree with a heavy stick. We split into small groups, each of us taking different paths, but staying close enough to reach each other by radio. My partner that night was a volunteer who'd only been with us for a few weeks. Poor guy looked terrified from the start. To be fair, so was I. At some point, we heard what sounded like scraping against wood, long, drawn-out scratches that made my skin crawl. We followed the noise, stepping carefully over roots and fallen branches. Our flashlight beams darted through the darkness, revealing nothing but trunks and thick undergrowth. The sound stopped as soon as we got close, replaced by an eerie stillness. Even the crickets went quiet. It felt like we'd walked into some predator's territory without an invitation. My chest was tight. Every time a twig snapped under my boot, I almost jumped out of my skin. We found fresh marks on a nearby shelter made of wood planks. The scratches were deep, more jagged than I expected, as if something strong was methodically trying to claw its way in. But that made no sense. We found no footprints, no droppings, no hair, just claw marks and twisted branches. We kept going, scanning the tree line. At one point, I caught a faint glimmer of light reflecting off eyes. It was just for a split second, but it was high up, much higher than any human could be, maybe near the top of a large oak. My flashlight flicked over to that exact spot, but it was gone. My pulse was racing, my mouth dry. The volunteer whispered that we should turn back, but I couldn't tear myself away. A part of me needed to be sure of what I saw. Suddenly, from somewhere to our left, came a heavy rustling and a quick burst of movement in the branches. I swung my light around, catching the outline of something crossing from one limb to the next. It was definitely not a raccoon or a possum. The shape was too big, almost like a human, but disturbingly wrong. Long arms, hunched posture, and a silhouette that didn't match any animal I knew. My blood ran cold. A second later, the noise was gone. The leaves quit shaking. We just stood there, me holding my breath, the volunteer almost in tears. Neither of us spoke a word. I felt completely vulnerable, like any second something would drop down onto us. We radioed the rest of the team, and they rushed to our location. By the time they arrived, it was quiet again. I remember that final stretch of the night so vividly. The forest seemed to hum with tension. We didn't see the creature again, but it felt like it was watching us. Eventually, we all regrouped at the ranger station, feeling more confused than ever. Some folks seemed ready to chalk it up to an overactive imagination, but a lot of us knew we'd witnessed something that defied explanation. I spent a few more hours pacing around, trying to decide what to do. The entire park was on high alert, but there was no clear next step. We didn't have the resources to mount a big search for something we couldn't even identify. The higher-ups talked about possible bear sightings, but we knew better. A bear doesn't climb around like that. And that was no prank either. No prankster could twist massive branches or leave scratch marks that deep. Then, just as fast as it all kicked off, it stopped. By early morning, no more noises, no more sightings, nothing. It was like whatever was out there had simply vanished, leaving behind only damaged trees and a handful of terrified people. The tension was still there in everyone's eyes, but the forest itself was back to its usual stillness. For the rest of the shift, I kept waiting for something else to happen, another strange noise, another flicker of movement. But there was nothing. All these years later, I still can't explain what we encountered. I've heard every theory. Escaped exotic pet, some weird undiscovered creature, or something out of a local legend. All I know is that the branches were real, the claw marks were real, and I definitely saw something up in those trees. Whenever I think back on that night, I get the same shiver down my spine. I've tried to push it to the back of my mind, but every once in a while I catch myself staring off into the woods, half expecting to see those twisted limbs or those reflective eyes again. Part of me wonders if it's still out there, hidden behind the leaves, waiting for night to fall. Nobody ever confirmed it. Nobody ever found solid proof. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever we crossed paths with that day was never meant to be found. And maybe that's why it disappeared just as quickly as it arrived.